Hey guys, welcome back. Medieval history is full of castles, crusades, and crown ceremonies. But it's also full of whispered accusations. Some queens were remembered as guardians of dynasties. Others, fairly or not, were branded as monsters in silk. And sometimes, the most evil thing a queen could do was simply win a power struggle in a world that expected her to lose. If you enjoy calm, long-form history that tries to separate legend from evidence, consider subscribing. It helps the channel, and it means you won't miss the next documentary. Now, let's step into the medieval courts where reputation could be weaponized, and where a queen's schemes often meant survival, strategy, and the hard mathematics of ruling. To understand the idea of an evil queen, we have to start with the medieval political environment itself. Queens were rarely allowed to rule openly in their own names, yet they were often expected to secure succession, manage alliances, and stabilize realms during crises. That contradiction created a perfect trap. When a queen acted decisively, building factions, negotiating marriages, financing campaigns, removing rivals, her actions could be described as statecraft if performed by a king, but as scheming when performed by a woman. Chroniclers, many writing under the patronage of the victors, then hardened those descriptions into moral judgments. The result is that some medieval queens became symbols. Convenient villains for civil wars, humiliating defeats, or unpopular taxes. But within those symbols, there were real people and real choices made under extraordinary pressure. One of the most famous examples is Isabella of France, the early 14th century queen who became known later as the She-Wolf. Isabella was married to Edward II of England, a king whose reign was marked by favoritism, political instability, and deep aristocratic resentment. In a court like that, evil schemes could look like simply building a coalition strong enough to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. Isabella's break with Edward II was not a sudden romantic betrayal in the modern sense. It was the culmination of years of factional conflict and a growing sense that she and her son's position was endangered. When she returned to England with Roger Mortimer and a small invasion force, it wasn't only an act of personal vengeance. It was also a seizure of political initiative, a gamble that the barons and towns would choose her leadership over a failing king. They did. Edward II was deposed, and Isabella's regency for the young Edward III began. That's where the evil queen story truly crystallized, because regencies are inherently unstable. A queen acting as guardian of the realm becomes an easy target for those who dislike her allies, distrust her judgment, or simply resent being ruled by a woman. Isabella and Mortimer were accused of corruption and tyranny, and the shadow over Edward II's death ensured that rumors would attach themselves to her forever. Yet if we zoom out, the core scheme here is starkly medieval. A queen leveraging alliances, legitimacy, and timing to remove a king whose rule had become politically unsustainable. Isabella's real sin, in many later retellings, was that she succeeded, until her own son decided he no longer needed her. A different kind of reputation surrounds Margaret of Anjou, queen to Henry VI during the Wars of the Roses. Margaret's name became shorthand, especially in later English tradition, for a foreign-born queen who dragged a fragile kingdom into bloodshed. But again, the medieval realities matter. Henry VI's rule was troubled by weak kingship, factionalism, and periods of profound incapacity. In that vacuum, the court did not become peaceful. It became predatory. If Margaret had remained passive, the Lancastrian dynasty could have been dismantled around her while she politely watched. Instead, she fought to secure her husband's crown and, crucially, her son's inheritance. That fight required coalitions with powerful nobles, negotiations across regions, and relentless political messaging. Activities that, in a man, might be praised as leadership. Margaret's schemes included rallying supporters, managing military appointments, and attempting to keep the Lancastrian cause coherent, while its opponents framed her as the true engine of conflict. Her story shows how queens could become the face of wars they did not start, simply because they were the most visible adult authority near a compromised king. The tragedy is that once civil war begins, moral labels become strategic tools. Calling your opponent evil is not merely commentary. It's recruitment propaganda, a way to harden loyalties and justify confiscations. Margaret's reputation, therefore, tells us as much about the information wars of the 15th century as it does about her personality. If Isabella and Margaret represent queens acting within the high politics of later medieval England and France, the early medieval period offers an even sharper example of how evil narratives were manufactured. The Merovingian queens Fredegund and Brunhilda. Their rivalry, embedded in the Frankish kingdoms of the 6th and 7th centuries, reads in the sources like a long, bitter sequence of plots, assassinations, and vengeance. Exactly the kind of material that later ages loved to dramatize. Fredegund is often depicted as ruthlessly ambitious, a woman who rose from lower status into queenship and then defended her position with relentless force. Brunhilda, a Visigothic princess turned Frankish queen, is portrayed as equally determined, building networks among bishops and nobles to preserve authority through decades of dynastic instability. In a world where the throne could pass to children, and where kingship was repeatedly divided among heirs, queens and queen mothers often became the only continuous thread of policy. The scheme was sometimes simply continuity, keeping a faction together long enough for a son or grandson to come of age. But continuity can be brutal in a system that invites challenge. The sources, often written by churchmen and political insiders with their own loyalties, depict Fredegund as a near-mythic villain and Brunhilda as a corrosive force who would not step aside. What is striking is not only the alleged crimes, but the way the narratives teach a moral lesson. Women who grasp at power bring disorder. That lesson is suspiciously convenient for the men who inherited the political order afterward. It doesn't mean these queens were gentle reformers. It means we should be careful about taking the most sensational accusations at face value when we're reading accounts designed to explain civil conflict through personal wickedness. Across these cases, a pattern emerges. Medieval queens were judged not only by what they did, but by how well their actions fit gendered expectations. A queen was supposed to be pious, supportive, and fertile, an idealized bridge between dynasties. Yet the moment she became a strategist, she entered a moral minefield. Diplomacy became manipulation. Patronage became corruption. Defending a child's inheritance became ruthless ambition. And because medieval political writing often blended moral storytelling with record-keeping, the chronicler's tone mattered as much as the facts they included. If a queen's faction lost, her actions could be retroactively described as unnatural, wicked, or even diabolical. If her faction won, her reputation might still suffer, because victory itself could feel threatening to a society that preferred women's influence to be invisible. The safest way to talk about evil schemes then, is to treat them as a window into how power actually worked. Queens did not usually command authority by issuing orders alone. They built households that functioned like miniature governments. They dispensed favors, negotiated marriages, cultivated church support, and managed access to the king. They understood that legitimacy was a resource, and that symbols, coronations, public appearances, the placement of seals on documents, could tip a political balance. When crisis hit, those skills became decisive. A queen who could hold a coalition together might keep a realm intact. A queen who misjudged her allies might trigger backlash that would echo for centuries. And this is where the term evil queen becomes almost too easy. It tempts us to reduce complicated conflicts into personal melodrama. But the more interesting story is harder and more human. These women operated in systems that offered them immense responsibility and limited permission. Some were undoubtedly capable of cruelty. Medieval politics often was. Yet the label evil was frequently applied not as a neutral verdict, but as a political instrument, used to explain chaos, excuse failures, and teach society what kind of female power should never be tolerated. In the next part, we'll slow down and look at how these reputations were built. Who wrote the stories, what they needed those stories to accomplish, and why certain queens, especially those who acted during regencies, civil wars, or disputed successions, became permanent fixtures in the medieval imagination. If we want to understand how medieval queens acquired reputations for evil schemes, we have to look closely at the people who told their stories. Most of what we know about figures like Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda comes from chroniclers, monks, clerics, court writers, who were deeply embedded in political and religious networks. They were not neutral observers. They wrote to praise patrons, defend institutions, and interpret upheaval through a moral lens their audiences would recognize. Medieval historiography did not separate politics from morality in the modern sense. When a kingdom fractured or a king was deposed, writers did not usually frame it as a failure of systems. They looked for personal causes. Someone must have sinned. Someone must have overreached. And when a queen stood near the center of that crisis, particularly if she exercised visible authority, she could become the embodiment of disorder itself. In this framework, calling a queen wicked was not simply an insult. It was an explanation. Take Isabella of France again. The narrative of the she-wolf hardened over time, especially in later English tradition. Yet contemporary sources were more varied. Some writers condemned the influence of Roger Mortimer, suggesting that Isabella had fallen under his sway. Others were more critical of Edward II's governance and favoritism, seeing the crisis as rooted in royal mismanagement rather than feminine ambition. Over the decades, however, a simpler story proved more compelling. A powerful queen, driven by passion and ambition, who overthrew her husband and ruled in his place. It had the clarity of drama. It reduced a complex baronial revolt into a tale of betrayal. Margaret of Anjou's image followed a similar path. During the Wars of the Roses, propaganda was not a modern invention, it was a survival tool. Yorkist writers painted Margaret as domineering and vindictive, a foreign queen whose influence destabilized England. The fact that she actively organized Lancastrian resistance only reinforced the narrative. But if we step back, we see that Margaret's actions were consistent with medieval expectations of a queen mother defending her son's inheritance. The real problem was that her son's claim was contested, and the king she was meant to support was intermittently incapable of ruling. In that vacuum, Margaret's visibility became a liability. She was not merely a consort. She was an actor. And actors in civil wars are always judged harshly by the side that loses. The earlier Frankish examples reveal another layer. In Gregory of Tours' account, Fredegund appears calculating and ruthless, while Brunhilda emerges as proud and unyielding. Their rivalry spans decades, overlapping with assassinations and brutal reprisals that were not unusual in Merovingian politics. Yet the chroniclers shape these events into moral theater. Fredegund becomes almost archetypal in her cruelty, while Brunhilda's long political endurance is framed as unnatural persistence. What is often lost in these portrayals is the structural instability of the Frankish kingdoms themselves. Kingship was divided among heirs. Territories were fragmented. Loyalties shifted constantly. In such an environment, a queen who did nothing would quickly become irrelevant or dead. Survival required calculation. It is also important to recognize how regency magnified suspicion. When a king died leaving a minor heir, the queen mother often became the most legitimate adult authority available. That authority, however, was temporary and conditional. Powerful nobles tolerated it as long as it suited them. The moment a regent appeared too autonomous, accusations followed. Greed, manipulation, immorality. The language varied, but the pattern was consistent. Regency exposed the contradiction at the heart of medieval queenship. A woman was trusted to safeguard the dynasty, but distrusted if she exercised too much independent judgment. Even cultural memory played a role. Medieval Europe inherited biblical and classical archetypes of dangerous women, figures who disrupted male authority or led men astray. Chroniclers did not need to invent new narrative frameworks. They could draw on familiar moral categories. A queen accused of ambition might be subtly linked to Eve's transgression or to classical examples of destructive female influence. These associations did not require explicit comparison. The audience would understand the implication. And yet, despite these layers of suspicion, many medieval queens were effective administrators and diplomats. They founded monasteries, negotiated treaties, arranged strategic marriages that reshaped alliances across Europe, and acted as intermediaries between rival factions. Their households often functioned as alternative centers of patronage, giving nobles and clerics access to influence that did not pass directly through the king. This dual structure could stabilize a realm or intensify factional competition, depending on the circumstances. When later generations looked back, they often preferred moral clarity to institutional complexity. It was easier to tell a story about a queen's wicked ambition than to explain the mechanics of feudal loyalty, inheritance law, and dynastic fragmentation. The label evil simplified history into character study, but that simplicity comes at a cost. It obscures the reality that medieval political life was inherently precarious, and that queens operated within constraints that shaped every decision they made. So when we hear about evil schemes, it's worth asking, schemes against whom and for what purpose? Was a queen consolidating power to dominate a realm or to prevent it from splintering? Was she manipulating alliances for personal gain or preserving her child's claim in a hostile environment? The answers are rarely pure. Medieval politics did not reward purity. It rewarded endurance, adaptability, and the ability to read shifting loyalties. In the end, The enduring fascination with medieval evil queens tells us as much about storytelling as it does about history. These women became symbols because they stood at the intersection of gender, authority, and crisis. Their reputations were forged in moments when kingdoms trembled, when succession was uncertain, and when chroniclers searched for moral meaning in chaos. And as we continue, we'll look more closely at how power, gender, and survival intertwined in the medieval world, shaping not only the lives of these queens, but the very way history chose to remember them. To go deeper, we need to examine the structure of medieval monarchy itself, because the system created the conditions in which queens were both essential and suspect. Medieval kingship was not an impersonal institution. It was personal, dynastic, and often fragile. Legitimacy flowed through bloodlines, marriage alliances, and public ritual. A queen stood at the heart of all three. Marriage in the medieval period was rarely about romance. It was a diplomatic instrument. A queen could represent a treaty embodied in human form. When Isabella of France married Edward II, the union symbolized a political understanding between England and France. When Margaret of Anjou married Henry VI, it was part of a larger diplomatic settlement designed to ease conflict between two kingdoms. That diplomatic function meant a queen was always slightly foreign, slightly symbolic, and occasionally mistrusted. If relations between kingdoms deteriorated, suspicion could fall quickly upon her. Queens also played a critical role in succession. Producing a male heir was not simply a private matter. It was the foundation of political continuity. When a queen bore a son, she secured her own position. When she failed to do so, she could be blamed for instability, regardless of biology or circumstance. This intense focus on succession meant that queen mothers often held extraordinary informal power. They were guardians of the future king, shaping his upbringing, his alliances, and sometimes his early policy decisions. It is precisely during these transitional moments, minorities, disputed inheritances, weakened kingship, that accusations of evil schemes multiplied. Consider again Margaret of Anjou. Her husband's mental health crises left England with long stretches of uncertain governance. In that uncertainty, rival claimants maneuvered. Margaret's decision to actively defend her son's rights was not outside the norms of dynastic politics. What made it controversial was the scale of resistance she faced. Civil war is rarely tidy. Each side produces its own moral narrative. In Yorkist accounts, Margaret became a destabilizing force. In Lancastrian circles, she was a defender of rightful rule. The divergence tells us that reputation was not fixed. It depended on which faction controlled the story. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated in an even more fragmented environment. The Merovingian practice of dividing kingdoms among sons ensured that rivalry was constant. A queen who secured influence over one region might see her position threatened by developments in another. In such a system, political violence was tragically common. Yet, when chroniclers singled out queens for particular condemnation, we see the gender double standard more clearly. Male rulers who ordered executions were described as forceful or decisive. Female rulers associated with similar actions were cast as unnatural or cruel beyond measure. This rhetorical asymmetry shaped centuries of memory. Another key factor was the medieval understanding of order. Society was imagined as a hierarchy ordained by God. Each person had a role: king, noble, cleric, peasant. A queen's role, ideally, was supportive and intercessory. She was expected to advocate mercy, sponsor religious institutions, and act as a moral complement to the king's authority. When a queen instead appeared to dominate councils or direct military responses, she could be portrayed as inverting the proper order. Even if her actions were pragmatic, they could be framed as disruptive. At the same time, we should not romanticize these figures as purely misunderstood. Medieval courts could be harsh environments. Alliances were built and broken with real consequences. Patronage meant distributing land, titles, and offices in ways that enriched some families and excluded others. A queen who favored one faction inevitably alienated another. Those excluded voices often found expression in chronicles and letters. What later generations interpret as proof of wickedness may sometimes be the residue of political disappointment. The construction of reputation also extended beyond a queen's lifetime. When Edward III overthrew Roger Mortimer and took personal control of the English government, distancing himself from his mother was politically useful. Blame for past excesses could be assigned to the regency. Similarly, when dynasties shifted, as they did repeatedly in medieval Europe, the new rulers had incentives to frame previous regimes as corrupt or misguided. Queens associated with those regimes absorbed part of that condemnation. Over time, these layered judgments hardened into legend. Shakespeare's portrayal of Margaret of Anjou, written centuries after the Wars of the Roses, amplified her image as fierce and implacable. Popular retellings of Isabella of France emphasized betrayal over governance. The early medieval rivalries of Fredegund and Brunhilda were retold with dramatic flourishes that blurred the boundary between documentation and moral fable. By the modern era, the phrase "evil queen" carried a fairy tale resonance, merging historical figures with archetypes. Yet when we peel back those layers, we find a consistent pattern. Queens navigating unstable systems, using the tools available to them. Marriage alliances, regencies, patronage networks, negotiation with church authorities, these were not dark arts. They were the mechanics of medieval rule. The difference lay in perception. A king exercising such tools confirmed expectations. A queen doing the same risked being labeled manipulative. Ultimately, the study of medieval evil schemes reveals something larger about power and narrative. History is not only what happened, it is how events were explained. For queens who lived at moments of crisis, explanation often took the form of moral judgment. To understand them fully, we must hold two ideas at once: that medieval politics could be ruthless, and that accusations of evil were themselves political weapons. And as we move toward the final reflections, we'll consider what these queens' stories tell us about memory, about why certain figures remain controversial centuries later, and why the image of the powerful medieval queen continues to fascinate audiences today. As we begin to draw these threads together, it becomes clear that the idea of the medieval evil queen survives not because it is historically precise, but because it is narratively powerful. The image is simple: a woman in a crown, whispering in corridors, moving pieces behind the throne. Feels dramatic, almost timeless. But real medieval governance was slower, heavier, and more procedural than legend suggests. Decisions were debated in councils, sealed in charters, and reinforced through oaths. Influence was rarely exercised in a single dramatic gesture. It was accumulated, negotiated, and defended over years. What makes queens like Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda endure in public imagination is not only what they did, but the moments in which they acted. Each stood at a fault line. Isabella during the deposition of a king, Margaret during a dynastic civil war, Fredegund and Brunhilda during a volatile era of divided Frankish rule. These were not quiet periods. They were times when legitimacy itself was contested. And when legitimacy is unstable, every political move can be framed as either necessary or monstrous. Another important dimension is memory shaped by later values. In modern discussions, we often look for strong female leaders in history, searching for examples of agency in restrictive systems. Medieval chroniclers, by contrast, were often uncomfortable with overt female authority. Their moral framework was different. A queen who stepped beyond traditional intercessory roles could be depicted as crossing boundaries established by divine order. That discomfort colored their writing. It does not mean their accounts are useless, but it does mean they must be read critically. Consider the difference between survival and ambition. In a medieval court, failing to secure alliances could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. Acting decisively was often less about expanding personal power and more about preventing annihilation. When Isabella aligned with English barons against Edward II, she was navigating a dangerous political landscape in which her own status had been undermined. When Margaret of Anjou gathered Lancastrian supporters, she was responding to a direct threat to her son's inheritance. In both cases, their actions can be read as defensive as easily as aggressive. The label applied depends on perspective. It is also worth noting that medieval queens were not operating alone. They were part of households that included advisors, clerks, knights, and churchmen. These networks amplified their reach but also complicated responsibility. When a controversial decision was made, was it truly the queen's independent will, or the product of counsel and negotiation? Chroniclers often personalized events for narrative clarity, attributing collective decisions to a single figure. That personalization made stories memorable, but also distorted the collaborative nature of power. The endurance of these reputations reminds us that history is shaped by storytelling traditions. Later writers, playwrights, and historians revisited these queens with their own agendas. Shakespeare's portrayal of Margaret cemented an image of ferocity that has influenced audiences for centuries. Victorian historians, writing in an era with strict ideas about gender roles, sometimes emphasized moral failings over structural explanations. Modern media occasionally leans into sensational elements because they capture attention. Each layer adds interpretation. Yet if we strip away exaggeration, what remains is something more complex and more human. Medieval queens were political actors constrained by expectation and empowered by circumstance. They could be capable of harsh decisions, as many rulers were in a violent age. But they were also administrators, patrons of religion, negotiators of peace, and guardians of continuity. Their so-called schemes were often indistinguishable from governance itself. Perhaps the most revealing question is not whether these queens were evil, but why societies needed them to be. In times of upheaval, it is comforting to locate blame in a single personality. It simplifies chaos, provides a moral lesson. It reassures the audience that disorder came from deviation rather than from the system's inherent instability. The evil queen becomes a cautionary tale, reinforcing norms about who should wield visible authority. And yet, centuries later, we are still discussing them. Not as fairy tale villains, but as historical figures whose lives illuminate the realities of medieval power. Their stories invite us to question how reputations are built, how gender shapes memory, and how politics can transform strategy into scandal. If there is a lasting legacy here, it is this: medieval queens were neither saints nor caricatures. They were rulers operating in environments that demanded resilience. The schemes attributed to them reveal as much about the anxieties of their chroniclers as about the choices they made. By looking carefully at their contexts, we move beyond simple labels and toward a clearer understanding of how authority functioned in the medieval world. And in doing so, we see that history is rarely divided into heroes and villains. More often, it is shaped by individuals navigating unstable systems, doing what they believed necessary to secure survival, legacy, and power in an age where none of those things were ever guaranteed. There is one final layer to consider when examining medieval evil queens, and that is the difference between personal morality and political necessity. Medieval Europe was not governed by modern bureaucracies or stable constitutions. Authority rested on landholding, sworn loyalty, military backing, and divine sanction. Every decision a ruler made had ripple effects across noble families, church hierarchies, and foreign courts. In that setting, hesitation could be as dangerous as aggression. For queens, this environment was even more precarious. Their authority was rarely absolute. It was relational, derived from marriage, motherhood, and proximity to the throne. When those relationships shifted, so did their security. A widowed queen might become a regent, wielding immense temporary authority, or she might find herself sidelined, dependent on the goodwill of male relatives. A queen whose husband lost favor with the nobility could lose protection overnight. Under such conditions, long-term planning was not simply ambition. It was insurance. Take again the example of regency. When a young king inherited the throne, the Queen Mother often became the central stabilizing figure. She mediated disputes, confirmed appointments, and worked to preserve alliances until her son could rule independently. But regency created tension. Nobles might accept her leadership publicly while maneuvering privately to limit her influence. If she appeared too decisive, she risked backlash. If she appeared too passive, she risked losing control of events. There was no safe middle ground. In that light, the so-called schemes attributed to queens begin to look less like conspiracies and more like strategic calculations. Securing a marriage alliance, redistributing offices to loyal supporters, negotiating with bishops for ecclesiastical backing, these were standard tools of governance. Yet, because queens were expected to embody virtue and mediation rather than overt command, their use of these tools could be portrayed as manipulative. The language of chroniclers often reflects discomfort not with the action itself, but with the identity of the actor. Fredegund and Brunhilda's rivalry in the Frankish kingdoms demonstrates this tension vividly. Both women navigated a political culture in which assassination, imprisonment, and rebellion were tragically common among male rulers as well. Yet their involvement in similar dynamics drew especially sharp condemnation. Their endurance, decades of influence across shifting reigns, was framed as evidence of unnatural ambition. But from another perspective, it was evidence of political competence in a volatile environment. Margaret of Anjou's story also illustrates how quickly reputation can harden once a conflict ends. When the Yorkists ultimately triumphed, it became easier to cast Margaret as a destabilizing force rather than as a determined defender of her dynasty. Victors write history, and they often simplify it. The complex interplay of regional loyalties, economic strain, and noble rivalry was distilled into character judgments. The Queen became a symbol of what went wrong. Isabella of France's legacy underwent similar reinterpretation. While her regency initially stabilized England after Edward II's removal, her later association with Mortimer provided a convenient focal point for criticism. When Edward III asserted his independence, distancing himself from the regency reinforced his legitimacy. The narrative of overreach of a queen and her ally exceeding proper bounds served a political purpose. It clarified the new king's authority by contrasting it with perceived excess. What we see across these examples is a pattern. Medieval queens who acted decisively during crisis were often remembered less for their administrative skill and more for the controversies that surrounded them. Their successes were fragile and easily overshadowed by the moral framing of chroniclers. And yet, despite centuries of distortion, these women remain central to the story of medieval Europe. They were not marginal figures. They influenced succession, diplomacy, warfare, and religious patronage. They shaped the political landscapes of England and the Frankish realms in ways that cannot be dismissed as secondary. Perhaps the most important lesson is that the concept of the evil queen tells us as much about fear as it does about fact. Fear of disorder, fear of reversed hierarchies, fear of visible female authority in a system built around male dominance. Those fears found expression in chronicles that blurred analysis with admonition. When we approach these figures today, we have the advantage of distance. We can examine multiple sources, compare perspectives, and recognize rhetorical patterns. We can acknowledge that medieval politics was often severe without reducing its participants to caricatures. In doing so, we replace the fairy tale archetype with something more accurate, complex individuals navigating dangerous terrain. And that complexity is ultimately more compelling than any legend. As we conclude, it is worth reflecting on why the image of the medieval evil queen continues to resonate so strongly in modern imagination. Part of the answer lies in narrative simplicity. History, when reduced to personalities, becomes easier to tell and easier to remember. A kingdom collapses not because of structural weaknesses or competing legal claims, but because one ambitious woman whispered in the wrong ear. That explanation is dramatic, tidy, and emotionally satisfying, but it rarely captures the full reality. The medieval world was defined by uncertainty. Borders shifted, alliances fractured. Succession laws were interpreted and reinterpreted depending on advantage. In such an environment, queens were often the only consistent adult authority linking one reign to the next. They carried institutional memory. They understood court factions. They maintained diplomatic ties with their natal families abroad. These were stabilizing functions, even if they were not always described that way. It is also important to consider how deeply medieval society valued symbolism. A queen's public image mattered. Her piety, her generosity to monasteries, her visible support of the king. These were not minor details. They reinforced the moral order that underpinned political authority. When a queen's behavior seemed to diverge from that ideal, whether fairly or not, it created anxiety. Chroniclers often responded to that anxiety by emphasizing moral language. Words like pride, ambition, or cruelty carried theological weight. They suggested not just political error, but spiritual imbalance. And yet, if we compare medieval queens to their male counterparts, the contrast in labeling becomes difficult to ignore. Kings who consolidated power through force were described as strong. Kings who eliminated rivals were sometimes called decisive. The same actions, when associated with queens, were more likely to be framed as evidence of unnatural influence. This does not mean queens were always innocent or misunderstood. It means that interpretation was rarely neutral. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, Brunhilda, each of these figures operated within the expectations and constraints of her time. They navigated marriage diplomacy, regency politics, factional rivalry, and the ever-present threat of rebellion. Some made choices that had harsh consequences. Some relied on advisors whose ambitions complicated their own reputations. But all of them functioned as political actors in systems that required strategic thinking. Over centuries, however, their stories merged with archetypes. The powerful queen became a warning figure in folklore and literature. The historical details faded, while the dramatic outline remained. That transformation tells us something about collective memory. We tend to preserve stories that reinforce cultural lessons. In medieval Europe, one of those lessons was about the dangers of visible female power. Today, revisiting these queens with a careful eye allows us to move beyond inherited labels. It invites us to examine the mechanics of medieval governance, how legitimacy was constructed, how regencies functioned, how factional alliances determined survival. It also reminds us that political systems shape reputations as much as personalities do. In the end, the phrase "evil schemes" may reveal more about the storytellers than the queens themselves. It reflects fear, rivalry, and the need to assign responsibility in turbulent times. When we step back and analyze the broader context, we see not fairy tale villains, but rulers responding to extraordinary pressures. And perhaps that is the lasting value of studying these medieval queens. Their lives show us how power, gender, and memory intertwine. They challenge us to question simplified narratives and to look instead at the structures beneath them. History becomes richer and more honest when we resist easy labels. Thank you for spending this time exploring the realities behind the legends. If you found this documentary helpful or thought-provoking, consider subscribing for more calm, in-depth explorations of the medieval world. Before we close completely, there is one more important perspective to consider: how the medieval concept of queenship itself evolved over time, and how that evolution shaped the reputations of so-called evil queens. Queenship in the early medieval Frankish world looked very different from queenship in later medieval England or France. Titles, coronation rituals, legal authority, and expectations shifted gradually across centuries. Yet one constant remained: the tension between visibility and acceptability. In the Merovingian period of Fredegund and Brunhilda, royal authority was deeply personal and often decentralized. Kings traveled with courts that functioned as mobile centers of governance. Loyalty was sworn to individuals rather than abstract institutions. In this setting, a queen who could influence access to the king or manage networks of patronage wielded genuine power. But because that power operated through proximity rather than formal office, it was easy to depict as covert or manipulative. Influence exercised quietly was labeled intrigue. By the later Middle Ages, monarchy had grown more administratively complex. Chanceries produced written records. Councils met with increasing regularity. Parliaments or estates assemblies emerged as advisory bodies. In this more structured environment, a queen's authority could sometimes be formalized, especially during regencies. Yet formal authority did not eliminate suspicion. Instead, it intensified scrutiny. When Margaret of Anjou presided over councils or corresponded with supporters during the Wars of the Roses, her actions were documented in ways that made her political engagement undeniable. Documentation, ironically, preserved both her influence and the accusations against her. Religion also played a role in shaping perception. Queens were expected to embody Christian virtue publicly. Patronage of monasteries, almsgiving, and devotional acts reinforced their legitimacy. When a queen appeared ruthless in political matters, chroniclers sometimes framed that ruthlessness as a contradiction of her spiritual role. The ideal queen interceded for mercy. She softened the king's severity. A queen who instead directed military resistance or endorsed punitive measures disrupted that expectation. Yet these ideals were not always realistic. Medieval politics could not function solely on mercy. Decisions about land, loyalty, and punishment were unavoidable. A queen acting as regent could not simply defer every conflict. She had to choose sides, reward allies, and confront opposition. In doing so, she crossed into territory culturally associated with masculine authority. That crossing was often the root of later condemnation. It is also essential to recognize that queens themselves understood the narratives forming around them. They were not unaware of reputation. Public ceremonies, carefully staged entries into cities, symbolic gestures of piety, all were part of managing perception. Isabella of France cultivated alliances with church figures. Margaret of Anjou emphasized her son's legitimacy as the rightful heir. These actions were not merely political. They were theatrical in the medieval sense, reinforcing messages through ritual and symbolism. Over time, however, once a queen's political fortunes declined, those same symbolic acts could be reinterpreted. Patronage became favoritism. Determination became stubbornness. Political partnership became improper influence. Reputation was fluid, shaped by who held power at any given moment. Looking back from our perspective centuries removed, we have the advantage of comparative analysis. We can place these queens alongside male rulers who employed similar tactics and notice the discrepancy in language. We can examine the broader social structures that limited their options. And we can see how later generations amplified certain traits while ignoring others. The enduring lesson is not that medieval queens were secretly virtuous heroines unfairly maligned, nor that they were uniquely ruthless figures. It is that they were rulers in a system that made neutrality nearly impossible. To survive, they had to engage in the same strategic calculations as their male counterparts. The difference lay in how those calculations were remembered. When we strip away centuries of moral coloring, the image that remains is more balanced. Isabella navigating baronial revolt. Margaret defending dynastic continuity in a fractured kingdom. Fredegund and Brunhilda contending with a violent and unstable political landscape. These are not fairy tale villains. They are historical actors responding to the pressures of their time. And perhaps that is the most valuable takeaway. The term evil queen may persist in popular culture, but history itself is more nuanced. It invites us to question inherited labels, to examine evidence carefully, and to understand that power, especially in the medieval world, was rarely simple and never without consequence. As a final reflection, it's worth considering how these medieval queens would likely have understood their own actions. They did not think in terms of villainy or heroism. They thought in terms of lineage, obligation, oath, and survival. The language of their world revolved around honor, divine favor, dynastic continuity, and the maintenance of order. To fail in defending a son's inheritance, or to allow a hostile faction to dominate the court, would not have been seen as virtuous restraint. It would have been negligence. In that sense, the so-called schemes attributed to queens such as Isabella of France or Margaret of Anjou were embedded in a culture where politics was inseparable from family. A dynasty was not an abstract brand. It was blood, memory, and the promise of stability for those who had sworn loyalty. When Isabella moved against Edward II, she did so in a context where leading nobles had already lost confidence in the king's governance. When Margaret rallied Lancastrian forces, she did so because rival claimants openly challenged her son's right to rule. The stakes were existential. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated in an even harsher environment, where succession disputes could erupt almost immediately upon a king's death. Their long rivalry was not an isolated drama but part of a broader pattern of fragmentation in the Frankish kingdoms. In that setting, passivity could be fatal. Influence had to be asserted and defended constantly. If chroniclers later described these efforts in moralistic terms, it reflected their worldview, but it does not erase the political logic behind the decisions. Another dimension we must acknowledge is the passage of time. Medieval sources were copied, edited, and interpreted by generations of scribes and historians. Small emphases could grow into defining traits. A single hostile account, if widely circulated, might overshadow more balanced perspectives that were lost or less preserved. By the time early modern writers revisited these figures, they were often working with narratives already shaped by centuries of repetition. That repetition gradually transformed complex individuals into symbols. Isabella became the archetype of the rebellious queen. Margaret became the embodiment of relentless dynastic struggle. Fredegund and Brunhilda became cautionary tales about ambition and vengeance. These symbolic roles were powerful because they spoke to enduring anxieties about authority and legitimacy. Yet when we slow down and examine the record carefully, the symbolism softens. We see administrators negotiating treaties. We see mothers protecting heirs. We see regents attempting to maintain continuity in unstable times. We also see miscalculations, political rivalries, and the inevitable consequences of civil conflict. The picture is neither entirely sympathetic nor wholly condemnatory. It is human. Studying these queens in depth challenges us to move beyond inherited stereotypes. It reminds us that history is constructed from sources that reflect their own agendas and assumptions. It encourages us to ask who benefits from a particular portrayal and what alternative explanations might exist beneath dramatic language. In the end, the fascination with medieval evil queens says something enduring about our relationship with power. We are drawn to figures who seem to operate behind the scenes, who disrupt expectations, who challenge established hierarchies. But when we replace myth with context, we gain something more valuable than drama. We gain understanding. These queens were not anomalies in an otherwise orderly world. They were participants in a political culture that demanded resilience and strategic thinking. Their reputations were shaped by conflict, by chroniclers, and by centuries of retelling. By looking carefully at their lives, we see not fairy tale villains, but leaders navigating one of the most complex and demanding environments in European history. And perhaps that quieter, more measured understanding is far more compelling than any legend. As we take one last step back, it becomes clear that the enduring label of the evil queen reveals as much about medieval society as it does about the queens themselves. Medieval Europe was built upon hierarchy, carefully ordered layers of authority that were believed to reflect divine intention. At the top stood the king, seen as God's appointed ruler. The queen's role, while prestigious, was traditionally framed as supportive and complementary. When that balance shifted, when a queen appeared to direct rather than advise, the tension was not merely political. It was ideological. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda each disrupted expectations in visible ways. They stepped into arenas that medieval observers associated primarily with kingship: military coordination, factional negotiation, regency governance, and strategic alliance building. Even when circumstances forced their involvement, their presence in these roles unsettled traditional narratives of order. Chroniclers, seeking to restore a sense of moral clarity, often resolved that discomfort by attributing unrest to personal ambition rather than structural instability. But instability was woven into the fabric of medieval rule. Succession crises were common. Communication across realms was slow. Loyalty depended on personal relationships that could shift with marriage, inheritance, or grievance. In that volatile system, the line between governance and intrigue was thin. A diplomatic letter could be interpreted as loyalty or conspiracy depending on the reader. A marriage alliance could be framed as prudent planning or manipulative expansion. Queens operated within that ambiguity constantly. It is also important to understand how memory compresses complexity. Over generations, nuanced political decisions fade, while striking character judgments remain. A queen accused of ruthlessness in one chronicle may be remembered for that accusation long after the specific circumstances are forgotten. As stories are retold, especially in literature and popular history, dramatic elements expand while administrative details shrink. What survives is the outline of a personality rather than the full texture of governance. And yet, these medieval queens were not passive figures overwhelmed by narrative. They shaped events in tangible ways. Isabella's intervention altered the English monarchy and paved the way for Edward III's reign. Margaret's determination kept the Lancastrian claim alive through some of England's most turbulent years. Fredegund and Brunhilda influenced decades of Frankish politics, ensuring that their names would not disappear from the historical record. Their impact was real, measurable in treaties signed, alliances forged, and conflicts endured. When we examine their stories calmly and carefully, we begin to see patterns that transcend individual reputations. We see how regency magnified scrutiny. We see how foreign birth could invite suspicion. We see how factional rivalry encouraged exaggerated moral language. and we see how later political settlements often required a simplified explanation of past turmoil. The phrase "evil schemes" may capture attention, but history itself is rarely so stark. Medieval queens operated in systems that required strategic thinking, resilience, and sometimes severity. They were judged within moral frameworks that constrained their acceptable behavior far more tightly than that of kings. Understanding this context does not absolve them of every harsh decision, but it does restore proportion. In the end, the legacy of these queens challenges us to approach the past with patience. Rather than accepting inherited labels, we can examine evidence, compare accounts, and consider broader structures. Doing so reveals a medieval world that was complex, unstable, and deeply human. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath the legends. That power in the Middle Ages, whether held by king or queen, was never simple. It demanded difficult choices, invited criticism, and left behind stories shaped as much by fear and rivalry as by fact. When we look beyond the archetype of the evil queen, we find something richer, a clearer understanding of how authority, memory, and narrative intertwine across centuries. Before we bring this documentary to a true close, there is one final angle worth exploring: the difference between how medieval queens were judged in their own time and how they are judged now. The distance of centuries allows us to ask questions that contemporaries rarely did. Medieval chroniclers were not conducting detached political analysis. They were interpreting events through theology, loyalty, and personal allegiance. We, by contrast, can compare multiple accounts, examine administrative records, and weigh structural pressures alongside individual decisions. When Isabella of France acted against Edward II, she did so in a kingdom already fractured by baronial resentment and royal favoritism. Her intervention did not create instability out of calm. It redirected an instability that was already present. Yet for many writers, especially those seeking moral clarity after a deposition, it was simpler to focus on her ambition than on the weaknesses of Edward's rule. Over time, that focus hardened into legend. The dramatic image of a queen overthrowing a king proved more memorable than a discussion of fiscal mismanagement and factional court politics. Margaret of Anjou faced a similarly unforgiving narrative. The Wars of the Roses were not caused by a single personality. They emerged from contested claims, regional rivalries, economic pressures, and the fragility of Lancastrian authority. But Margaret's visible leadership during her husband's incapacity made her an easy focal point. To Yorkist writers, portraying her as overbearing and destructive strengthened their own claim to restore order. The language of moral failure served a political function. Fredegund and Brunhilda, writing in an earlier and more fragmented political world, became almost mythic in their portrayal. Their rivalry unfolded in a context where kingship itself was divided repeatedly among heirs, guaranteeing conflict. Yet instead of framing the turmoil as a systemic outcome of succession practices, chroniclers often personalized it. The queens became embodiments of vengeance and pride. In a society that valued divinely sanctioned hierarchy, attributing chaos to individual moral failing preserved the belief that the structure itself was sound. What is striking across all these examples is how often structural instability was translated into personal blame. Medieval political culture did not easily admit that systems could be flawed. It was more comfortable to suggest that individuals had transgressed proper boundaries. For queens, those boundaries were already narrow. Acting decisively in a public political role meant stepping into contested territory. Even when necessity demanded it, the optics could be dangerous. From a modern perspective, we can also recognize the limitations imposed on these women. They did not inherit the throne with automatic legitimacy in the way male heirs did. Their authority was conditional and often temporary. To secure lasting influence, they had to cultivate networks, manage reputations, and anticipate threats constantly. Their margin for error was small. A misjudged alliance could cost not only position, but life. And yet, despite these constraints, medieval queens shaped the course of European history. They negotiated peace settlements, directed regencies, and ensured dynastic continuity across turbulent generations. Their actions had consequences that extended well beyond court intrigue. The kingdoms of England and the Frankish realms were altered by their decisions, whether praised or condemned. Perhaps the enduring fascination with evil queens reflects a broader human tendency to dramatize power. A strong, visible woman in a medieval court disrupts expectations even today. The archetype persists because it is vivid. But when we slow down and examine the evidence carefully, we see complexity rather than caricature. These queens were products of their time, operating within hierarchical, volatile, and deeply personal political systems. They made calculated decisions in environments where passivity could mean erasure. Their reputations were shaped by chroniclers who sought moral lessons in political upheaval. And those reputations were amplified by centuries of retelling. In the end, the phrase "evil schemes" tells us less about secret plots and more about the anxieties surrounding authority. Medieval queens who stepped beyond ceremonial roles became lightning rods for fear and rivalry. But they were also administrators, negotiators, and guardians of dynasties. By looking at their lives with patience and context, we move beyond legend and toward understanding. History becomes not a tale of villains and heroes, but a study of power under pressure. And in that quieter, more measured light, medieval queens appear not as fairy tale antagonists, but as complex rulers navigating some of the most demanding political landscapes of their age. That deeper perspective, perhaps, is the most compelling story of all. If we take one final moment to reflect on the broader medieval landscape, it becomes even clearer why queens who acted forcefully were remembered so sharply. Medieval Europe was not a world of strong central governments in the modern sense. Authority depended on loyalty that had to be constantly renewed through rewards, marriages, ceremonies, and sometimes displays of strength. Kings were expected to lead in war, dispense justice, and maintain divine favor. Queens, meanwhile, were expected to reinforce dynastic stability and moral legitimacy. But when those expectations collided with political crisis, the boundaries between roles blurred. In times of war or civil conflict, hesitation could fracture a kingdom permanently. A queen who waited for consensus might find herself overtaken by faster-moving rivals. A queen who acted swiftly risked appearing domineering. This double bind shaped the experiences of Isabella of France and Margaret of Anjou most visibly. Both faced moments when royal authority was visibly weakened. Both chose intervention over passivity. And both were later judged not only by the outcomes of their actions, but by the fact that they dared to act at all. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated in a still earlier phase of European monarchy, when royal authority was deeply entwined with family rivalry. The Merovingian custom of dividing territory among sons ensured overlapping claims and constant negotiation. In such a landscape, queens were often the only stable thread connecting successive reigns. They remembered previous alliances, previous betrayals, and previous settlements. That memory was a source of power, but also suspicion. Longevity in politics could be reframed as manipulation. Another important factor is the nature of medieval communication. Rumors traveled through letters, sermons, and oral retellings long before they were written down. Once a narrative began to circulate about ambition, cruelty, or improper influence, it could spread rapidly among noble households and ecclesiastical circles. Chroniclers then recorded what they had heard, sometimes without distinguishing clearly between verified fact and politically useful rumor. Over time, repetition created authority. What was once allegation became accepted memory. Yet even within these charged narratives, there are signs of complexity. Some chroniclers acknowledged queens' intelligence and administrative skill, even while criticizing their severity. Others praised their piety alongside accounts of political maneuvering. These mixed portrayals remind us that medieval observers themselves did not always see these figures in purely black and white terms. The stark archetype of the evil queen is often the result of later simplification. From a structural perspective, medieval monarchy was vulnerable because it relied so heavily on personal competence. When a king was weak, ill, or politically isolated, the vacuum did not disappear. It demanded to be filled. Queens, especially those with strong natal families or cultivated alliances, were often best positioned to step into that vacuum. Doing so, however, meant challenging deeply rooted assumptions about visible authority. The long afterlife of these queens' reputations also speaks to our own cultural interests. Stories of power behind the throne are compelling because they suggest hidden influence and decisive agency. They transform administrative decisions into dramatic intrigue. But when we return to the documents, charters, diplomatic correspondence, regency records, we find evidence of governance that is methodical rather than theatrical. Land grants confirmed, alliances negotiated, disputes arbitrated. These are not the marks of fairy tale villainy. They are the marks of rule. In reassessing Isabella, Margaret, Fredegund, and Brunhilda, we do not need to strip away every harsh judgment. Medieval politics could indeed be unforgiving, and these queens sometimes endorsed severe measures. What matters is proportion. Kings in similar circumstances often acted with equal severity. The difference lies in how memory framed their actions. Ultimately, the idea of evil schemes obscures a more instructive reality: that medieval queens were integral participants in the survival and transformation of their realms. They were not anomalies operating outside the system. They were working within it, sometimes stretching its boundaries, sometimes reinforcing them. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion to draw from this long journey through medieval courts. When we move beyond legend and examine context, we discover rulers shaped by pressure, not caricatures shaped by fear. Their stories remind us that power, especially in an age of fragile dynasties, demanded resilience above all. Thank you for spending this time exploring the realities behind the reputations. Medieval history becomes far richer when we allow it to be complex, and when we recognize that even the most dramatic legends often rest on foundations of very human choices. As we reach the true end of this exploration, it is worth asking one final question. What would medieval Europe have looked like without these queens? It is easy to imagine them removed from the narrative, replaced by quieter consorts who never intervened. But history rarely leaves a vacuum unfilled. If Isabella of France had remained passive, England's baronial crisis under Edward II would not have vanished. It might instead have produced a more chaotic overthrow, perhaps even greater instability. If Margaret of Anjou had withdrawn from politics, the Lancastrian claim would still have faced Yorkist challenge. The conflict would not have dissolved simply because she stepped aside. In the Frankish kingdoms, if Fredegund or Brunhilda had abandoned political engagement, rival factions would still have contested succession with equal intensity. In other words, these queens did not invent instability. They responded to it. Medieval political systems were inherently vulnerable because they relied on personal bonds and hereditary transmission. When those bonds weakened, decisive action was required. Queens were often among the few figures positioned to provide continuity during these fragile transitions. It is also important to understand that medieval concepts of justice and severity differed from modern sensibilities. Actions that seem ruthless today were often considered pragmatic responses in a culture where rebellion could fracture a realm permanently. Kings who crushed revolts were rarely labeled inherently evil for doing so. They were sometimes praised for restoring order. Queens who aligned themselves with similar measures, however, could be accused of overstepping moral boundaries. The judgment was not solely about the act, but about the actor. As centuries passed, these distinctions faded, but the emotional charge remained. Later writers, especially in periods fascinated by court intrigue, emphasized dramatic elements. The image of the calculating queen became a literary motif, appearing in chronicles, plays, and eventually popular storytelling. The real administrative labor of governance, the drafting of charters, the negotiation of truces, the management of estates, received far less attention. What endured were scenes of confrontation and accusation. Yet, if we examine surviving records carefully, a more measured portrait emerges. Isabella corresponded with allies and secured parliamentary support before moving openly. Margaret organized resources and negotiated with regional leaders in an attempt to consolidate backing. Brunhilda issued legal reforms in the territories she influenced. These actions reflect structured governance, not impulsive villainy. The persistence of the evil queen narrative also reveals how societies grapple with female authority more broadly. In medieval Europe, a woman exercising open political control unsettled established norms. Chroniclers, consciously or not, expressed that unease through moral language. Their accounts were shaped by expectations about hierarchy, gender, and divine order. When queens defied those expectations, even out of necessity, their reputations bore the weight of that discomfort. From our vantage point today, we are not bound by those same assumptions. We can evaluate these figures by comparing their actions to those of male contemporaries. We can analyze patterns across regions and centuries. We can recognize that power, in any era, involves negotiation, compromise, and occasionally force. Ultimately, what makes the stories of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda enduring is not that they were evil. It is that they were influential at moments when influence mattered most. They stood at crossroads of succession and survival. Their decisions shaped kingdoms. Their reputations were forged in the aftermath of conflict. If there is a final lesson here, it is one of caution. Labels like evil simplify history, but they rarely clarify it. Medieval queens were complex participants in systems that demanded strength and adaptability. Their so-called schemes were often the visible edge of deeper political realities. By looking beyond the dramatic phrasing and into the context beneath it, we gain something richer than legend. We gain insight into how medieval power truly functioned and how memory can transform governance into myth. And with that, we close this chapter on medieval queens and the reputations that followed them, leaving behind caricature and embracing complexity instead. Even after everything we've explored, there remains a subtle but important dimension to these stories: the relationship between fear and authority. Medieval societies were deeply concerned with order. Order was not merely political, it was cosmic. The structure of the kingdom mirrored what was believed to be the structure of creation itself. God above, king beneath him, nobles beneath the king, and so on through carefully defined ranks. Stability depended on each layer performing its expected role. When that structure appeared threatened, anxiety followed. And few scenarios unsettled medieval observers more than visible female dominance within political life. A queen who acted too forcefully could be portrayed as upsetting the natural hierarchy. Chroniclers sometimes used language that hinted at inversion, suggesting that proper order had been turned upside down. These were not casual phrases. They reflected a worldview in which deviation from assigned roles carried moral weight. Yet the reality on the ground was rarely so tidy. Kings died unexpectedly. Heirs were minors. Illness, military defeat, or factional rivalry could weaken royal authority overnight. In those moments, strict adherence to ceremonial expectations was not enough to preserve stability. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to rally allies, negotiate settlements, and prevent fragmentation. Frequently, that someone was the queen. Isabella of France's intervention did not occur in a vacuum of ambition. It arose from prolonged dissatisfaction with Edward II's governance among powerful nobles. Margaret of Anjou's leadership during the Wars of the Roses did not create dynastic rivalry. It confronted an already escalating challenge. Fredegund and Brunhilda's rivalry unfolded within a system that virtually guaranteed conflict through divided inheritance. Their actions must be understood within these contexts. Another factor often overlooked is resilience. Medieval courts were not forgiving environments. Political missteps could result in exile, imprisonment, or loss of property. For queens, especially those of foreign birth, the margin for security was even narrower. Their natal families were distant. Their primary protection lay in maintaining influence within their adopted realm. This required attentiveness, adaptability, and sometimes bold action. Survival itself demanded strategic awareness. Over time, however, survival strategies could be reframed as ambition. Defensive measures could be described as aggression. And because many surviving sources were written by men embedded in ecclesiastical or noble hierarchies, their interpretations carried authority. These writers were not inventing events wholesale, but they were selecting emphasis, deciding which details to highlight and which to minimize. What remains striking is how persistent these reputations became. Centuries after their deaths, these queens still appear in discussions framed by intrigue and severity. That endurance tells us something about storytelling traditions. The archetype of the powerful, potentially dangerous queen became part of European cultural imagination. It bridged history and folklore, blending documented political maneuvering with moral cautionary themes. Yet, when we examine administrative records, legal reforms, and diplomatic correspondence, we encounter rulers engaged in governance as much as in rivalry. Brunhilda's involvement in legal standardization, Isabella's management of regency administration, Margaret's coordination of regional alliances. These actions speak to responsibility as well as conflict. They reveal queens participating in the maintenance of state structures, not merely subverting them. Perhaps the most measured conclusion we can draw is this: medieval queens were neither saints nor caricatures. They operated within volatile systems that required constant negotiation. Their reputations were shaped by political outcomes and by cultural expectations about gender and authority. When they succeeded, their power unsettled observers. When they failed, their failures were moralized. History becomes richer when we resist the temptation of simple labels. The phrase "evil schemes" captures attention, but it flattens nuance. Behind it lie questions about legitimacy, succession, and the delicate balance of medieval governance. In looking carefully at Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda, we see a pattern repeated across centuries. Women navigating the highest levels of power in societies that were not designed to accommodate them easily. Their actions were sometimes severe, sometimes prudent, often necessary. Their legacies remind us that authority in the medieval world was always contested, and that memory, shaped by those who wrote it, can transform strategy into scandal. And so, rather than leaving them as figures of legend, we can leave them as what they truly were: central participants in the unfolding story of medieval Europe, operating under pressures that would test any ruler in any age. As we bring this long journey to its quiet conclusion, it is worth considering how differently these queens might be remembered if the medieval world had been more stable. If succession had been predictable, if royal authority had been institutionally secure, if factional rivalry had been less intense, would Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, or Brunhilda have attracted the same moral scrutiny? Probably not. Their reputations were forged in turbulence. Without crisis, there would have been fewer accusations, fewer chroniclers searching for explanations, fewer opportunities to cast decisive action as dangerous ambition. Medieval monarchy operated on a delicate balance between personality and principle. A strong king could mask structural weaknesses. A weak king exposed them. When exposure occurred, those closest to the throne inevitably became involved in managing the fallout. Queens, by virtue of proximity and dynastic importance, were almost always among those figures. Their involvement was rarely optional. It was compelled by circumstance. And yet, the cultural script into which their actions were written left little room for overt authority. Medieval political thought drew heavily on religious metaphor. The kingdom was often imagined as a body, with the king as its head. The queen's place in that metaphor was less clearly defined. She was integral but not central. When she appeared to guide the body herself, chroniclers sometimes interpreted it as disorder rather than adaptation. What we see across centuries is a consistent pattern. Queens who exercised sustained influence during moments of instability were remembered more controversially than those who remained within ceremonial bounds. Isabella's regency, Margaret's wartime leadership, Brunhilda's long administrative involvement, Fredegund's persistent political maneuvering, all placed them in roles that required firmness. Firmness, when enacted by a queen, was frequently described with sharper language than when enacted by a king. It is also important to recognize that medieval politics left little space for retreat. Once engaged in a power struggle, withdrawal could mean exile or erasure. Compromise was possible, but it depended on trust, something often in short supply during succession crises. Queens who had secured alliances could not simply abandon them without consequence. Their reputations became tied to outcomes that were only partially within their control. Over time, the repetition of dramatic elements overshadowed quieter achievements. The maintenance of estates, the sponsorship of religious reform, the careful negotiation of truces. These administrative labors rarely capture popular imagination, but they formed the backbone of governance. When we examine surviving documents, we find evidence of sustained engagement in precisely these areas. The historical record, though shaped by bias, still preserves traces of responsibility and competence. Perhaps what endures most strongly is the tension between expectation and necessity. Medieval queens were expected to embody harmony, yet necessity often demanded assertiveness. They were expected to symbolize continuity, yet crisis required intervention. That tension produced discomfort, and discomfort produced narrative exaggeration. As modern readers, we are not obligated to accept those exaggerations at face value. We can appreciate the drama without mistaking it for the whole truth. We can acknowledge that medieval courts were capable of severity while recognizing that such severity was not uniquely female. And we can see that the label evil often functioned less as a moral verdict and more as a political shorthand. In the final measure, these queens stand not as villains carved from legend, but as rulers shaped by pressure. Their decisions influenced the direction of kingdoms. Their reputations were molded by those who sought to explain turbulent times. By revisiting their stories with patience and context, we replace caricature with complexity. And perhaps that is the most meaningful outcome of all. Medieval history, when approached calmly and carefully, reveals not monsters or saints, but human beings navigating fragile systems of power. In understanding that, we gain a clearer view not only of the past, but of how narratives are built and rebuilt across generations. As a final, steady thought to leave with you, it helps to remember that medieval Europe did not think about reputation the way we do today. There was no unified public opinion measured across a nation. Reputation moved through courts, monasteries, noble households, and marketplaces in fragments. A sermon here, a chronicle entry there, a rumor carried by a traveling retainer. These small threads gradually wove together into something that looked like consensus. By the time later historians encountered these queens in written form, much of that weaving had already been done. For Isabella of France, the narrative of overreach solidified because it fit neatly with the restoration of direct royal rule under Edward III. For Margaret of Anjou, the image of relentless ambition aligned with Yorkist justifications for regime change. For Fredegund and Brunhilda, writing in a world where dynastic violence was common, chroniclers framed rivalry through moral extremes. In each case, the story that endured was the one that served stability after turmoil. But there is another layer worth acknowledging. Medieval queens themselves understood the importance of legacy. Patronage of religious institutions was not only spiritual devotion, it was also a means of shaping memory. Foundations, endowments, and charters carried names forward. Queens invested in monasteries, churches, and charitable works in part because these institutions preserved written records. They were conscious, at least to some extent, that history would remember them. Even so, no ruler controls the full arc of their posthumous image. Once power shifts, interpretation shifts with it. A queen's allies might fade from influence, leaving hostile accounts dominant. Generations later, writers with new political concerns might reinterpret old events to suit contemporary debates about authority and gender. Over centuries, nuance erodes and archetype strengthens. Yet, when modern historians return to primary sources, cross-referencing letters, financial records, land grants, and diplomatic correspondence, a fuller portrait emerges. We see Isabella coordinating support before decisive action. We see Margaret organizing resources and correspondence across contested regions. We see Brunhilda associated with legal reforms and administrative continuity. We see Fredegund maneuvering within a violent succession landscape that offered few safe alternatives. These details complicate the caricature. None of this transforms medieval politics into something gentle or idealized. Power struggles were real. Punishments could be severe. Alliances were fragile. But these realities applied broadly, not selectively. The difference in memory often lies in who was permitted to embody authority without moral suspicion. In reflecting on these queens, we are reminded that history is shaped by two forces: events and interpretation. Events place individuals in moments of crisis. Interpretation decides how those moments will be remembered. When a queen steps forward in a time of instability, interpretation becomes especially charged. The phrase "evil schemes" survives because it captures attention and condenses complexity into a single image. Yet behind that image stand years of negotiation, strategy, and survival within demanding systems. The medieval world required rulers, male or female, to act decisively when order faltered. Queens who did so left visible marks on their kingdoms. And so, as we close this extended exploration, the enduring takeaway is one of perspective. Medieval queens were central actors in the maintenance and transformation of European realms. Their reputations were forged in crisis and shaped by those who wrote the record. When we read their stories carefully, we uncover not simple villainy, but layered human experience. History, approached calmly, allows us to see beyond legend. It invites us to recognize that authority in the Middle Ages was negotiated, contested, and remembered through lenses colored by expectation. And in that recognition, the medieval evil queen becomes less a figure of fear and more a window into how power and memory truly functioned across the centuries. As we let the dust settle on these centuries of conflict and memory, one final reflection remains. Medieval queens were often remembered at their loudest moments, at the height of rebellion, during a deposition, in the midst of civil war. But no reign and no life consists entirely of crisis. Between the dramatic turning points were years of administration, correspondence, negotiation, and routine governance. Those quieter years rarely make their way into popular retellings, yet they form the greater part of historical reality. Isabella of France did not exist solely in the shadow of Edward II's downfall. She participated in the governance of England during her regency, navigating diplomatic ties with France and managing domestic stability during her son's minority. Margaret of Anjou's life was not limited to battlefield politics. She worked continuously to maintain alliances, raise funds, and secure recognition for her son's claim. Brunhilda's long involvement in Frankish affairs extended beyond rivalry. She influenced administrative practice and maintained continuity across successive reigns. Even Fredegund, remembered most vividly for her ruthlessness, operated within courtly structures that required calculation rather than constant confrontation. These broader spans of time remind us that medieval queenship was a sustained responsibility. It required literacy or reliance on trusted literate advisors, familiarity with legal customs, awareness of regional loyalties, and the ability to interpret shifting alliances. It demanded endurance. To survive politically over decades in such an environment was itself a testament to resilience. When we reduce these figures to evil schemes, we compress decades of complexity into a handful of charged episodes. That compression may make for compelling storytelling, but it obscures the lived texture of their rule. Medieval governance was incremental. It unfolded through charters confirmed, marriages arranged, disputes arbitrated, and religious institutions supported. These actions do not carry the theatrical quality of rebellion or deposition, yet they shaped the stability of kingdoms just as surely. It is also worth acknowledging that the idea of the dangerous queen did not arise only from hostility. It reflected genuine uncertainty about how female authority should function in a male-dominated hierarchy. Medieval political theory did not fully anticipate sustained female governance, even though circumstances often required it. This gap between theory and reality produced friction. That friction found expression in moralized narratives. Modern audiences, looking back, have the advantage of detachment. We can recognize that medieval political systems were imperfect and that crisis was common. We can compare the rhetoric applied to queens with that applied to kings. And we can see how frequently accusations of overreach mirrored the anxieties of those recording events. In the end, the medieval evil queen is less a historical category and more a storytelling device. It reflects the discomfort that arises when power shifts unexpectedly, when established roles blur, and when survival demands decisive action. The queens we have discussed, Isabella, Margaret, Fredegund, Brunhilda, were not outside their systems. They were deeply embedded within them, responding to pressures that would test any ruler. By returning to context, we recover proportion. We see that their reputations were shaped not only by what they did, but by who judged them and when. We understand that governance in the Middle Ages was rarely gentle, and that resilience often required firmness. And so, as we close this extended exploration, what remains is not a gallery of villains, but a set of lives that illuminate the realities of medieval authority. These queens were participants in the making and remaking of kingdoms. Their stories endure because they stood at moments when history turned. If we approach them with patience rather than assumption, we gain something deeper than drama. We gain insight into how fragile power can be, how narratives are constructed, and how memory transforms complex rulers into symbols. And in that quieter understanding, the medieval past feels less like legend and more like lived experience. As we ease into the final stretch of this long exploration, it's worth reflecting on how easily the medieval world invites exaggeration. Castles, crowns, rival dynasties, It already feels dramatic before a single accusation is made. When a queen stands at the center of political upheaval, it almost seems inevitable that later generations will heighten her image. But history, when approached calmly, resists that heightening. It slows the pace. It replaces spectacle with process. And process is what defined most of these queens' lives. Isabella of France did not simply arrive in England and overturn a kingdom in a moment of fury. Her break with Edward II developed over years of political tension, diplomatic frustration, and aristocratic unrest. Her eventual intervention relied on negotiation, coalition building, and calculated timing. Margaret of Anjou's leadership during the Wars of the Roses was not a single burst of ambition, but an extended attempt to preserve dynastic continuity under extraordinary strain. Fredegund and Brunhilda, locked in rivalry across decades, navigated a Frankish world in which succession customs virtually guaranteed instability. Their actions unfolded across time, shaped by evolving alliances and shifting threats. What we often call schemes were, in reality, sustained strategies. Medieval politics demanded that rulers think in terms of generations, not headlines. A marriage alliance might take years to bear fruit. A regency might last until a child reached maturity. A territorial settlement might only stabilize a border temporarily before new disputes emerged. Queens were deeply involved in these extended calculations. Another dimension that complicates the evil queen narrative is the role of counsel. Medieval governance was rarely solitary. Kings and queens alike operated within councils composed of nobles, clerics, and advisors. Decisions were debated, influenced, and sometimes resisted. When a controversial policy emerged, chroniclers might attribute it to the queen's will, but behind that attribution stood a network of competing voices. The personalization of politics makes for clearer storytelling, yet it flattens collaborative realities. We should also remember that medieval chroniclers wrote for audiences who expected moral clarity. Turmoil required explanation. Explaining turmoil through structural analysis would not have satisfied readers accustomed to theological framing. Instead, chroniclers often drew on familiar moral language: pride, greed, vengeance, ambition. These words signaled more than behavior. They signaled spiritual imbalance. When applied to queens, they carried additional weight because female authority was already culturally sensitive. Yet across all the examples we've examined, Isabella, Margaret, Fredegund, Brunhilda, one theme persists: endurance. These were not fleeting figures swept briefly into power. They maintained influence across years of instability. Endurance in medieval politics was no small feat. It required adaptability, intelligence, and a deep understanding of shifting loyalties. Even their critics, unintentionally, testify to their effectiveness by documenting how long they remained central. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes this endurance as evidence of political skill rather than mere ambition. When we look beyond dramatic phrases and examine administrative records, we see queens involved in land management, dispute resolution, religious patronage, and diplomatic correspondence. These activities form the backbone of governance. They lack the theatrical quality of rebellion, but they sustained kingdoms. In the end, the phrase "evil schemes" reflects a tension between expectation and reality. Medieval society expected queens to embody virtue and mediation. Reality sometimes demanded assertiveness and strategy. When those two images collided, narrative friction followed. What remains after we strip away exaggeration is something quieter but far more instructive. Medieval queens were neither mythical villains nor flawless reformers. They were rulers shaped by their time, operating in systems that were personal, fragile, and often unforgiving. Their reputations were constructed by observers who sought meaning in disorder. And perhaps that is the lasting insight of this entire journey. The medieval evil queen is less a fixed historical category than a mirror reflecting cultural anxieties about power and gender. When we look steadily into that mirror, we see not just the queens themselves, but the societies that judged them. By approaching their stories with patience, context, and balance, we gain something richer than legend. We gain perspective on authority, on memory, and on how history transforms human resilience into enduring narrative. As we reach what is truly the closing reflection of this long study, it may help to step back from individual names and consider the broader arc of medieval queenship itself. Across centuries, from the fractured Frankish kingdoms to the dynastic struggles of late medieval England, queens occupied a position that was simultaneously central and constrained. They were indispensable to legitimacy, yet perpetually measured against expectations that limited overt authority. The reputations of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda were not accidents of personality alone. They were shaped at the intersection of crisis and cultural assumption. Each woman acted during periods when monarchy was visibly fragile. Each operated in systems where succession was contested and alliances were volatile. Each faced rivals who had strong incentives to discredit her. Under those conditions, narrative became a battlefield alongside territory. What is striking is how durable those narratives proved to be. Centuries after their deaths, these queens are still introduced with qualifiers: ambitious, ruthless, scheming, while many of their male contemporaries are remembered more neutrally, even when they employed similar tactics. This asymmetry tells us that memory does not distribute judgment evenly. It filters events through expectations about who should wield power and how. Yet time has also provided us with tools for reassessment. We can compare chronicles written from opposing factions. We can examine financial records, legal decrees, and diplomatic correspondence. We can identify where rhetoric diverges from administrative reality. In doing so, we uncover a more layered picture. Rulers who negotiated, calculated, sometimes misjudged, and often endured. Endurance may be the most telling quality of all. Medieval political life was perilous. Courts shifted allegiance quickly. Illness, defeat, or rumor could undo years of stability. For a queen to maintain influence across such uncertainty required more than ambition. It required resilience and strategic awareness. Even hostile chroniclers, in documenting their prolonged involvement, inadvertently confirm that these women were not marginal figures. The idea of the evil queen persists because it condenses complexity into a dramatic symbol. It offers clarity in place of ambiguity. But history, when studied patiently, rarely supports such clarity. It reveals instead a web of causes: economic strain, inheritance customs, regional loyalties, religious authority, within which individuals make constrained choices. Isabella's regency cannot be understood apart from baronial discontent under Edward II. Margaret's wartime leadership cannot be separated from the fragile Lancastrian claim. Brunhilda's and Fredegund's rivalry cannot be divorced from a Frankish system that divided power among heirs. When these contexts are restored, the dramatic label of evil schemes begins to dissolve into something more grounded: political strategy within unstable systems. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Medieval queens were not anomalies disrupting an otherwise orderly world. They were participants in its maintenance and transformation. Their actions were shaped by necessity as much as by desire. Their reputations were molded by those who needed moral explanations for turbulent events. In approaching their stories calmly and without exaggeration, we do not diminish their significance. We deepen it. We see that authority in the Middle Ages was negotiated daily, that legitimacy required constant reinforcement, and that survival often demanded firmness. The medieval evil queen, stripped of legend, becomes a lens through which we understand how societies respond to visible female power in moments of crisis. She becomes a reminder that narrative can amplify fear as easily as fact. And she invites us to read history with attentiveness rather than assumption. With that, we close this extended exploration not with caricature but with context, not with spectacle but with understanding. Medieval queens remain compelling not because they were villains, but because they stood at the heart of fragile kingdoms and chose to act. As a final, measured thought to leave you with, it helps to consider how fragile medieval stability truly was. We often imagine kingdoms as solid, clearly bounded entities, but in the Middle Ages authority could shift with a marriage, a death, a rumor, or a single failed campaign. Governance depended on loyalty that had to be renewed constantly. In that environment, influence was not an abstract quality. It was a living, breathing force, maintained through negotiation, presence, and resolve. Queens stood at the center of that fragile structure. Through marriage, they linked dynasties. Through motherhood, they secured succession. Through patronage, they shaped networks of obligation. These roles were not decorative. They were structural. Remove them, and the architecture of monarchy weakens. Yet, because their authority flowed through relationships rather than formal titles alone, it was often described as indirect or hidden. That description easily slipped into suspicion. Isabella of France's political maneuvering during Edward II's troubled reign did not occur in isolation. It unfolded within a court already divided by favoritism and resentment. Margaret of Anjou's wartime leadership was not born of sudden ambition, but of a kingdom divided by contested legitimacy. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated in a Frankish world where divided inheritance and rival claimants made conflict nearly inevitable. In each case, the queen's actions were responses to structural pressures. The phrase "evil schemes" suggests secrecy and malice. Yet, when we look closely, what we often find are strategies shaped by necessity. Alliances were forged because isolation was dangerous. Offices were distributed because loyalty required reward. Rivals were confronted because inaction could mean collapse. Medieval politics rarely allowed for clean hands. The expectations placed on queens, however, often demanded the appearance of moral purity alongside political effectiveness, a nearly impossible balance. Another reason these reputations endured is that they offer narrative clarity. It is easier to remember a story centered on a powerful personality than one rooted in legal customs or inheritance law. Chroniclers writing after periods of upheaval often simplified causes into character flaws. That simplification traveled well across generations. Plays, popular histories, and modern retellings reinforced it. Yet beneath that clarity lies a more intricate truth. Medieval governance was collaborative and contested. Queens relied on councils, advisors, kinship networks, and ecclesiastical allies. Their decisions emerged from conversation and constraint, not from isolated impulse. When their policies succeeded, stability returned quietly. When they failed, the consequences were visible and dramatic. Memory tends to preserve the latter more vividly than the former. If we allow ourselves to look beyond the dramatic label, we see rulers navigating uncertainty with the tools available to them. We see women operating within male-dominated systems, sometimes bending expectations, sometimes reinforcing them, always negotiating their place. We see reputations shaped by victors and carried forward by tradition. In the end, the enduring image of the medieval evil queen reflects not only past anxieties, but also the human desire for stories that simplify complexity. But history, when approached patiently, resists simplification. It reminds us that power is rarely pure, that crisis demands difficult choices, and that memory can transform strategy into scandal. By revisiting the lives of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda with context and balance, we restore dimension to figures long confined to caricature. They were not merely symbols of disruption. They were participants in the survival of kingdoms. And perhaps that is the quietest, most enduring truth of all. Medieval queens were neither shadows nor monsters, but central actors in a world where authority was always fragile, and where resilience often determined whether a dynasty endured or disappeared. As we settle into one final layer of reflection, it may help to shift our focus from accusation to environment. Medieval Europe was not governed by stable institutions in the modern sense. Law codes existed, councils convened, and traditions were respected, but ultimate authority remained deeply personal. It flowed through bloodlines, oaths, and visible leadership. When that flow was disrupted, tension spread quickly. Queens, positioned at the intersection of dynasty and diplomacy, inevitably became part of the solution or part of the blame. What stands out across the lives of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda is not merely controversy, but proximity to succession crises. Succession was the most dangerous moment in any medieval polity. The death of a king could trigger disputes that exposed every underlying rivalry. If the heir was young, absent, or contested, uncertainty deepened. In those moments, the queen was often the most experienced political figure remaining at court. Experience, however, did not guarantee acceptance. A queen acting to stabilize a minority government might be praised by one faction and condemned by another. The same correspondence that secured loyalty could be framed as conspiracy. The same alliance that preserved dynastic continuity could be interpreted as favoritism. Medieval politics was not a neutral arena. It was a contest of narratives as much as armies. Fredegund and Brunhilda illustrate how prolonged rivalry could shape historical memory. Their conflict unfolded in a world where territorial division among heirs was common practice. That practice itself fostered competition. Yet, instead of attributing instability to structural inheritance customs, chroniclers often personalized it. They emphasized temperament, ambition, and moral failing. In doing so, They converted systemic volatility into character drama. Margaret of Anjou's reputation developed along similar lines. The Wars of the Roses were rooted in disputed claims and regional power struggles. Yet Margaret's visibility during her husband's incapacity made her a convenient symbol of Lancastrian resistance. When political fortunes shifted, that symbolism hardened into moral critique. Her resolve was reframed as obstinacy, her defense of her son's rights as destructive ambition. Isabella of France, too, became defined by the moment she stepped beyond expected boundaries. Her intervention during Edward II's troubled reign was shaped by baronial discontent and concerns about governance. Yet later memory often condensed the complexity of those grievances into a narrative of personal betrayal. The broader institutional weaknesses of the period faded into the background. One consistent theme emerges. Medieval queens were judged not only by their outcomes, but by their visibility. Authority exercised discreetly could pass with less comment. Authority exercised openly, especially in times of conflict, drew scrutiny. Queens who appeared decisive unsettled expectations rooted in hierarchy and tradition. And yet, the deeper record reveals governance rather than melodrama. Charters were issued, estates were managed, diplomatic missions were coordinated, religious patronage reinforced legitimacy. These were not peripheral activities. They were central to maintaining rule. Even in the midst of rivalry, administrative continuity persisted. Perhaps what lingers most powerfully is the reminder that history is shaped by those who record it. Chroniclers sought moral coherence in turbulent times. Their language reflected their worldview. Over generations, that language became part of cultural memory. The evil queen emerged less from a single act than from cumulative retelling. When we approach these figures calmly, with attention to context and comparison, the caricature softens. We see rulers responding to pressure, constrained by expectation, and determined to secure survival for their dynasties. We see how gender amplified scrutiny, but did not erase agency. In the end, the medieval evil queen tells us as much about storytelling as it does about sovereignty. It reminds us that authority, especially in fragile systems, is rarely simple, and it invites us to look beyond dramatic labels toward the quieter, more revealing patterns beneath them. That perspective, steady and measured, allows us to leave legend behind and carry forward something more enduring. An understanding of how power, crisis, and memory intertwine across centuries. As we close this exploration with one last steady reflection, it is worth considering how power itself is remembered differently depending on who holds it. Medieval Europe did not lack ruthless kings. It did not lack ambitious princes or calculating nobles. Yet the memory of their actions was often framed within the expected boundaries of masculine rule. Severity could be justified as strength. Political maneuvering could be interpreted as prudence. Authority, when exercised by a king, fit comfortably within the cultural script. When queens exercised similar authority, the script strained. Isabella of France intervened in a political environment already fractured by favoritism and baronial hostility. Margaret of Anjou defended her son's claim during a dynastic conflict that would likely have unfolded with or without her leadership. Fredegund and Brunhilda navigated a Frankish system that almost guaranteed rivalry among heirs. In each case, the queen's involvement was inseparable from structural instability. Yet over time, Their agency became the focal point, as though their presence alone explained the turbulence. This pattern reveals something subtle about how medieval society processed disruption. It was easier to attribute chaos to a visible figure than to confront the weaknesses embedded in inheritance customs or governance structures. Personalizing disorder restored a sense of moral clarity. If turmoil resulted from ambition, then restoring proper hierarchy could promise peace. The evil queen narrative, in this sense, functioned as reassurance. It implied that instability was not systemic, but exceptional. And yet, the deeper record suggests otherwise. Succession disputes recurred across medieval Europe regardless of who occupied the throne. Minority reigns were consistently vulnerable. Regional loyalties competed with central authority. These dynamics were not anomalies. They were features of the political landscape. Queens operating within that landscape faced the same pressures as kings, though with narrower margins of acceptance. Another element often overlooked is how much these queens invested in legitimacy beyond raw power. Religious patronage was not merely decorative piety. It reinforced alliances with ecclesiastical institutions that legitimized rule. Diplomatic marriages were not simply familial arrangements. They shaped cross-border stability. Regency councils were not private intrigues. They were formal attempts to maintain continuity during vulnerable transitions. These activities required foresight and administrative engagement. Over centuries, however, memory gravitated toward moments of confrontation rather than continuity. The deposition of Edward II overshadowed the administrative work of Isabella's regency. The battles of the Wars of the Roses eclipsed Margaret's diplomatic efforts. The rivalry between Fredegund and Brunhilda became more prominent than the governance that surrounded it. Drama endures more vividly than routine. What remains most compelling about these queens is not the accusations that followed them, but the resilience they displayed. To operate at the center of medieval power was to accept constant uncertainty. A single miscalculation could result in exile or worse. Maintaining influence across years of volatility required intelligence, adaptability, and a keen understanding of political currents. The enduring lesson, perhaps, is that labels rarely capture lived reality. The term evil schemes flattens the complexity of decisions made under immense pressure, transforms strategy into scandal. But when we reintroduce context, when we examine systems, expectations, and structural forces, the narrative shifts. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda were not anomalies disrupting peaceful kingdoms. They were actors responding to fragile circumstances. Their reputations were shaped by those who needed moral explanations for political change. Their stories remind us that authority, especially in hierarchical societies, is always interpreted through cultural lenses. And so, as we end this extended reflection, what remains is not a gallery of villains, but a deeper appreciation of medieval governance. Power in that world was personal, precarious, and constantly negotiated. Queens who stepped into its center did so knowing that visibility carried risk. By looking carefully and patiently at their lives, we move beyond archetype and into understanding. We see that history is not built from simple moral categories, but from human choices made within demanding systems. And in that understanding, the medieval evil queen becomes less a figure of fear and more a window into the realities of power itself. As we reach the last quiet turn in this long discussion, it may be helpful to reflect on how differently these queens might appear if we encountered them without the weight of inherited labels. Imagine reading only administrative records, treaties, marriage contracts, and council notes, without the charged language of later chroniclers. The picture would likely seem less theatrical and more procedural. We would see rulers responding to events, securing alliances, managing estates, and confronting rivals when necessary. In other words, we would see governance. The enduring image of the medieval evil queen survives because it compresses governance into personality. It simplifies the slow grind of political management into moments of intrigue. But governance in the Middle Ages was rarely impulsive. It was shaped by tradition, obligation, and survival. A queen could not simply impose her will without consequence. She needed backing from nobles, acknowledgement from clergy, and at least passive acceptance from the broader political community. Isabella of France's intervention in England required baronial support. Margaret of Anjou's campaigns relied on regional alliances and foreign assistance. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated within networks of aristocratic families whose loyalty could not be taken for granted. These were not solitary actors manipulating events from isolation. They were participants in a shared political culture that demanded negotiation. And yet, because they stood at the center of visible crises, their names became shorthand for upheaval. It is easier to say that a kingdom faltered because of a queen's ambition than to explain the slow erosion of consensus among competing elites. It is easier to tell a story of rivalry than to unpack the legal complexities of divided inheritance. Drama leaves a clearer imprint than structure. Another reason these reputations persisted lies in the cultural power of archetype. Across medieval and early modern literature, the figure of the formidable queen carried symbolic weight. She could represent temptation, disruption, or reversal of order. When historical figures fit even loosely into that mold, the archetype amplified their memory. Over generations, distinction between literary pattern and political reality blurred. But modern analysis allows us to untangle that blur. By comparing accounts, identifying rhetorical patterns, and situating events within broader trends, we gain a more grounded perspective. We see that succession crises were common regardless of who advised the throne. We see that regencies always attracted scrutiny. We see that factional rivalry was a structural feature of medieval politics, not a personal invention. None of this diminishes the agency of these queens. On the contrary, it clarifies it. They were not passive figures carried by events. They made choices. Some of those choices were controversial. Some were harsh. But they were shaped by the demands of maintaining dynastic continuity in unstable times. Their influence was real, and so were the consequences of their decisions. What fades under closer examination is the simplistic moral framing. The label of evil tells us little about governance and much about perception. It reveals how societies process fear and change. It shows how visible female authority could unsettle expectations. And it reminds us that memory is often more dramatic than the lived reality it records. In the final balance, the stories of Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda invite us to approach medieval history with patience. They encourage us to look beyond inherited narratives and to consider context, comparison, and complexity. They demonstrate that power in the Middle Ages was neither static nor purely ceremonial. It was contested, negotiated, and deeply personal. And perhaps that is the most lasting impression to carry forward. Medieval queens were not shadows behind thrones, nor caricatures of ambition. They were central figures navigating systems that were fragile and demanding. Their reputations, shaped by conflict and chroniclers, continue to echo. But when we listen carefully, we hear not only accusation, but resilience. As we truly close this extended examination, it may be helpful to leave behind the word evil altogether and consider instead the concept of risk. Medieval queens lived in a world defined by risk, political risk, dynastic risk, reputational risk. Every decision carried consequence. To remain inactive during a succession dispute was risky. To intervene was equally risky. To trust one faction over another could secure stability or invite betrayal. Isabella of France took the risk of aligning herself with discontented nobles when Edward II's rule faltered. Had she misjudged their strength, her fate could have been exile or worse. Margaret of Anjou took the risk of leading Lancastrian resistance when her husband's authority collapsed. A quieter course might have preserved personal safety, but at the likely cost of her son's claim. Fredegund and Brunhilda took the risk of sustaining influence across decades of rivalry in a Frankish world where political defeat could be final. Risk, in this context, replaces caricature. It reminds us that these women were not operating from positions of guaranteed dominance. They navigated fragile alliances and shifting loyalties. They acted because inaction was rarely neutral. In medieval governance, silence could be interpreted as weakness. Decisiveness could be interpreted as ambition. Either interpretation could shape a chronicler's pen. The medieval court was also a space of constant negotiation. Authority flowed not only from crown and title, but from relationships. Marriages arranged, lands granted, disputes resolved. Queens often stood at the crossroads of these exchanges. They facilitated diplomacy between natal families and adopted realms. They reinforced legitimacy through religious patronage. They participated in ceremonial life that signaled continuity. These were not peripheral contributions. They were essential. Yet when crises erupted, the language of explanation narrowed. Chroniclers searched for causes that fit moral frameworks. Structural instability, divided inheritance customs, weak fiscal systems, competing regional interests, was harder to dramatize. A queen's visible presence was easier. Over time, narrative momentum gathered around that presence. It is telling that modern historians, when revisiting these periods, tend to widen the lens. They examine economic strain, legal precedent, military logistics, and demographic change alongside personal decisions. When viewed in this broader context, the reputations of Isabella, Margaret, Fredegund, and Brunhilda appear less singular. They become part of recurring patterns across medieval Europe. What remains consistent is their resilience. To endure at the heart of power across years of upheaval required adaptability and resolve. Even when their fortunes turned, their impact lingered. Edward III's reign unfolded in the shadow of his mother's regency. The Yorkist settlement followed years shaped by Margaret's leadership. The Frankish political landscape bore marks of rivalry that extended beyond individual lifetimes. Perhaps the most measured conclusion we can draw is that medieval queens were often judged not only for what they did, but for how visibly they did it. Visibility in times of crisis invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites interpretation. Interpretation, repeated over centuries, becomes legend. But when we step back and examine the full arc of their lives, we see more than legend. We see human beings responding to uncertain conditions with the tools available to them. We see rulers navigating expectation and necessity in equal measure. And we see how memory can simplify what was, in reality, profoundly complex. In the end, the medieval evil queen dissolves into something more instructive. A reminder that authority, especially in fragile systems, is never free from controversy. It is shaped by context, judged by contemporaries, and retold by generations who inherit both the facts and the fears of the past. And so we leave these queens not as villains of folklore, but as central figures in the intricate and demanding world of medieval governance, remembered, debated, and ultimately understood with greater clarity when we look beyond the label and into the history itself. As we arrive at the final reflection in this long documentary journey, it's worth considering one last dimension: legacy beyond controversy. When we look back across centuries, what ultimately defines a ruler is not the rumor that surrounded them, but the structural changes and continuities that followed their time in power. Isabella of France's regency helped bridge one of England's most unstable transitions. However controversial her actions, the monarchy that emerged under Edward III was stronger, more assertive, and politically recalibrated. Margaret of Anjou's determined defense of Lancastrian claims prolonged a dynastic struggle that reshaped English governance, ultimately influencing how succession and legitimacy were understood. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated within a Merovingian framework that would later give way to Carolingian consolidation. Yet their long rivalry revealed the weaknesses in divided kingship that future rulers sought to correct. In this sense, these queens were not merely participants in turmoil. They were catalysts within evolving systems. Turbulent reigns often expose structural flaws. Minority governments, disputed inheritance customs, and factional instability do not vanish quietly. They produce reforms, recalibrations, and sometimes entirely new dynastic frameworks. The presence of strong queens during these transitions was not incidental. It was part of the mechanism through which medieval polities adapted. What is particularly revealing is that their influence did not end with their political defeats or deaths. Their children, rivals, and successors governed in landscapes shaped partly by their interventions. The memory of Isabella's regency influenced Edward III's consolidation of authority. The shadow of Margaret's resistance lingered through Tudor reinterpretations of English kingship. The Frankish world that followed Fredegund and Brunhilda inherited a heightened awareness of the dangers embedded in divided succession. This reminds us that history is cumulative. Even reputations framed negatively can coexist with long-term institutional impact. A chronicler may condemn ambition, but administrative adjustments may still endure. Narrative and consequence are not always aligned. It is also important to recognize that medieval queenship gradually evolved. By the later Middle Ages, the idea of queens acting as regents or exercising political authority during crises had become more familiar, even if still contested. Earlier controversies, including those associated with queens like Brunhilda, formed part of that evolution. Each high-profile regency contributed, in some way, to the broader understanding of what queenship could encompass. The evil queen archetype, then, becomes less a fixed judgment and more a transitional label, applied at moments when expectations lagged behind reality. As political systems changed, so too did the space available for female authority. But memory often preserved the tension of earlier eras, repeating accusations long after circumstances had shifted. When we read these stories today with distance and context, we are not required to choose between admiration and condemnation. Instead, we can recognize complexity. We can acknowledge that medieval governance involved severity and compromise alike. We can see that queens operated under intense scrutiny, yet still shaped events decisively. Ultimately, what remains most striking is endurance, both theirs and their stories. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, and Brunhilda continue to appear in discussions of medieval power because they stood at crossroads of change. Their lives illuminate how authority functioned when systems were strained. And perhaps that is the quiet, enduring truth beneath the dramatic title of evil schemes. What we are really witnessing is the tension between expectation and necessity, between structure and personality, between narrative and reality. When we slow down and examine that tension carefully, we gain something far more valuable than legend. We gain insight into the mechanics of medieval rule, the fragility of dynastic stability, and the powerful role memory plays in shaping how history is told. And with that understanding, we can finally leave behind the caricature and carry forward a clearer, steadier picture of medieval queens as central actors in the long, complex story of Europe's past. As we settle into this final meditation on medieval queens and their reputations, it is worth turning from politics to perception one last time. What truly lingers across centuries is not only what these women did, but how their stories were told and retold in changing cultural climates. The Middle Ages themselves were not static. Early medieval Frankish politics differed greatly from the courtly structures of 14th century England or the factional battlegrounds of 15th century dynastic conflict. Yet the idea of the formidable queen, dangerous, ambitious, disruptive, proved remarkably adaptable. It could be reshaped to suit new anxieties, new political settlements, and new literary tastes. Fredegund and Brunhilda were remembered in chronicles that blended moral instruction with historical account. Isabella of France's image shifted as English monarchy evolved and later writers sought clarity in moments of deposition. Margaret of Anjou's portrayal hardened under Tudor retrospection, when stability under a new dynasty required a simplified narrative of the past. Each era reframed these women according to its needs. What does that tell us? It tells us that reputation is rarely fixed at the moment of action. It is constructed in layers. The first layer may come from contemporaries, friends, enemies, observers. The next layer comes from those who inherit the political consequences. Later still, dramatists, historians, and popular storytellers refine the image further, smoothing nuance into symbol. By the time these queens entered modern consciousness, they carried centuries of interpretation. The word evil attached itself less because of a single decision and more because repeated retellings favored moral clarity over structural explanation. It is far easier to narrate ambition than to unpack inheritance law. Far easier to describe rivalry than to outline fiscal weakness or regional autonomy. Yet the deeper record, when approached patiently, continues to resist simplification. It shows queens issuing charters, overseeing estates, engaging with ecclesiastical leaders, and navigating diplomatic correspondence. It reveals governance as a sustained process rather than a sequence of dramatic gestures. There is also something deeply human beneath these layers of memory. Each of these queens faced uncertainty that would test any ruler. Succession was rarely secure. Allegiances shifted. Illness and warfare could overturn careful planning. Their actions, sometimes forceful, sometimes conciliatory, were attempts to secure continuity in a world that offered no guarantees. Perhaps the most balanced way to view them is not as embodiments of vice or virtue, but as rulers shaped by the expectations and constraints of their time. They operated in patriarchal societies that both depended upon and distrusted female authority. When crisis demanded visibility, they stepped forward. When stability returned, they were judged for having done so. And so, as this exploration finally draws to its close, we are left not with a catalog of villains, but with a clearer understanding of medieval power. Authority in that world was fragile and personal. It demanded negotiation, resilience, and sometimes severity. Queens who entered that arena were bound to attract scrutiny. The enduring fascination with medieval evil queens tells us as much about storytelling as about sovereignty. It reflects our attraction to dramatic personalities and our discomfort with complexity. But history, when read carefully, offers something steadier. It offers context. It offers proportion. And it offers the reminder that behind every charged label lies a human life lived within the pressures of its own time. In that quieter understanding, the medieval queen ceases to be a caricature. She becomes what she always was, a central actor in the fragile, evolving architecture of medieval Europe, remembered not because she was evil, but because she mattered. As we reach what is genuinely the final quiet passage of this documentary, it may help to reflect not on controversy, but on continuity. Medieval history is often told through disruption, battles, rebellions, depositions, rival claimants. Yet kingdoms endured, dynasties rose, fractured, and reformed. Institutions adapted. Beneath the turbulence, something held. Queens were part of what held it. Isabella of France, Margaret of Anjou, Fredegund, Brunhilda. Each stood at moments when continuity seemed uncertain. Their actions, whether praised or condemned, were attempts to prevent total collapse. They sought to preserve lineage, protect inheritance, or stabilize fractured courts. Even when their efforts failed or were reversed, they shaped the trajectory of the realms they inhabited. The endurance of monarchy in medieval Europe depended on more than battlefield success. It relied on legitimacy, the belief that rule was rightful and continuous. Queens were essential to that belief. Through marriage alliances, they linked competing powers. Through motherhood, they embodied succession. Through ceremonial presence, they reinforced divine sanction. These were not symbolic details. They were pillars of political order. And yet, because queens were so visible in moments of strain, they absorbed disproportionate blame when systems faltered. A failed king could be excused as unfortunate. A forceful queen could be portrayed as disruptive. The moral framing followed expectations more than outcomes. When we examine the lives of these women across decades rather than through isolated crises, a pattern of resilience emerges. Isabella navigated exile and return, regency and retreat. Margaret endured defeat, captivity, and shifting alliances. Brunhilda survived multiple reigns before her dramatic fall. Fredegund maintained influence in a volatile political landscape. These are not the arcs of passive figures. They are the trajectories of rulers deeply embedded in the workings of power. Modern readers, with access to comparative scholarship and broader evidence, can see that medieval instability was systemic rather than exceptional. Succession disputes recurred. Minority governments were vulnerable. Regional loyalties competed with central authority. These pressures existed regardless of who wore the crown. Queens who stepped into leadership roles did not create these tensions, they confronted them. It is tempting to cling to the drama of the phrase evil schemes because it suggests clarity. But clarity is rarely accurate in the study of medieval governance. Decisions were made within constraints, economic, familial, diplomatic, and religious. Every ruler, male or female, operated within those boundaries. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from this exploration is humility before complexity. Medieval queens cannot be reduced to archetypes without losing the texture of their world. Their reputations were shaped by chroniclers seeking moral coherence. They were refined by later writers who preferred narrative sharpness over nuance. And they persist today because powerful women in turbulent times remain compelling figures. But when we step back from legend and approach the record calmly, we find not monsters behind thrones, but central participants in the fragile balancing act of medieval rule. We see individuals navigating expectation and necessity, reputation and reality, continuity and crisis. And so, as we conclude this extended journey through medieval courts and chronicles, we leave behind the caricature of the evil queen. In its place stands something steadier and far more instructive. A portrait of authority under pressure, of governance shaped by uncertainty, and of memory shaped by those who tell the story. Thank you for spending this time exploring the deeper layers of medieval history. If you found value in this calm, careful examination, consider subscribing for more long-form documentaries that look beyond legend and into the structure beneath it. Until next time, we'll leave the castles and chronicles behind, quietly, thoughtfully, and with a clearer understanding of the past. As we let the final echoes of this discussion fade, it may be helpful to frame these queens within a broader historical rhythm, the rhythm of rise, fracture, and renewal that defined much of medieval Europe. Kingdoms were rarely static. Authority shifted between generations, between rival branches of families, and between regional power centers. In that rhythm, queens often stood at transitional points, acting as bridges between what had been and what was still uncertain. Isabella of France bridged a troubled reign and a more assertive monarchy under Edward III. Margaret of Anjou occupied the space between fragile Lancastrian authority and the violent reshaping of English kingship. Fredegund and Brunhilda existed within a Merovingian order that would eventually give way to new configurations of Frankish power. In each case, their presence marks a hinge in the historical narrative. What makes these moments so charged is that transitional periods generate explanation. When a kingdom changes direction, through deposition, civil war, or dynastic reordering, observers seek reasons. Structural causes are often complex and diffuse. Personal causes are easier to grasp. A queen's decisive action, especially when it disrupts expectation, becomes a focal point. Yet, if we look carefully, transitions in medieval governance rarely stemmed from a single will. They unfolded from accumulated tensions, disputes over inheritance law, dissatisfaction among nobles, economic pressures, regional autonomy, military setbacks. Queens operating at the center of these pressures were responding to conditions long in motion. The durability of their reputations reflects the power of narrative over time. Chroniclers writing in the aftermath of upheaval sought coherence. Later historians inherited those accounts. Playwrights and popular storytellers amplified dramatic elements. Over generations, nuance narrowed. The complexity of court politics receded, while the image of the formidable queen endured. And still, beneath those layers, the archival record remains. It shows queens engaging in governance not only during crisis, but during ordinary administration. It shows them supporting ecclesiastical reform, overseeing estates, facilitating diplomacy, and reinforcing ceremonial legitimacy. These quieter responsibilities sustained the very systems within which conflict later emerged. It is also worth acknowledging that medieval society's discomfort with visible female authority contributed to the persistence of the evil queen image. A woman exercising command in a male-dominated hierarchy unsettled established norms. That unease shaped language. Words like ambition or manipulation carried additional weight when applied to queens. But as modern observers, we are not bound by those same assumptions. We can compare across regions and centuries. We can evaluate similar actions by male rulers and note the difference in tone. We can restore context to episodes that have long been told in isolation. In doing so, we recover balance. Isabella of France was neither a shadowy puppet master nor a passive consort. Margaret of Anjou was neither solely destructive nor purely heroic. Fredegund and Brunhilda were neither mythical villains nor mere victims of hostile chroniclers. They were rulers navigating the pressures of succession, alliance, and survival in systems that offered few guarantees. And perhaps that is the quietest, most enduring conclusion. Medieval queens mattered because they stood where legitimacy was contested and continuity uncertain. Their reputations were shaped by the outcomes of struggles larger than themselves. When we look beyond dramatic labels, we find stories of adaptation and endurance rather than simple malice. History, approached patiently, replaces caricature with contour. It reminds us that power in the medieval world was negotiated daily, that memory is constructed gradually, and that even the most charged reputations rest upon complex human realities. With that understanding, we can finally let these queens return to their centuries, not as villains of legend, but as central actors in a fragile and evolving political landscape. As we take our final, unhurried look at these medieval queens, there is one last perspective worth considering: the passage of silence. After the battles ended, after the councils dissolved, after the rival claimants either triumphed or fell, life continued. Fields were tilled, monasteries prayed, trade resumed along familiar roads. Kingdoms did not collapse into permanent chaos. They recalibrated. And in that recalibration, the presence of queens, however controversial, was part of the process. Isabella of France eventually withdrew from direct political control, yet the monarchy she helped reshape endured and expanded. Margaret of Anjou's cause ultimately failed, yet the dynastic struggle she embodied led to a restructuring of English kingship that influenced the Tudor settlement. Fredegund and Brunhilda's rivalry did not destroy the Frankish world. Instead, it exposed vulnerabilities that later leaders addressed in different ways. Turbulence did not erase continuity, it forced adaptation. What lingers across these stories is not destruction alone, but transformation. Medieval Europe evolved through crisis. Succession disputes prompted clearer claims of legitimacy. Civil wars redefined loyalty. Regency governments tested administrative resilience. Queens operating within these moments were agents of that evolution, even when their reputations suffered in the telling. It is easy to forget how precarious medieval authority truly was. There were no standing bureaucracies immune to personality, no stable constitutional frameworks to absorb shock without visible strain. Governance depended on human relationships, family ties, sworn oaths, negotiated alliances. Queens, by virtue of marriage and motherhood, stood at the heart of those relationships. Their influence was not an anomaly, it was structural. And yet, because it was structural and visible, it was also vulnerable to reinterpretation. When stability returned, societies often preferred to explain past turmoil through the lens of exceptional individuals. The label of evil offered closure. It suggested that disruption had been the product of deviation rather than of systemic fragility. But history, when examined slowly, reveals that fragility was constant. Even in periods we remember as stable, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The lives of Isabella, Margaret, Fredegund, and Brunhilda remind us that crisis is rarely sudden. It builds over time, and those positioned closest to power are inevitably drawn into its resolution. Perhaps what endures most quietly is the reminder that authority in the medieval world was not abstract. It was embodied. Decisions were personal. Alliances were familial. Reputation could be as decisive as force. Queens who engaged directly with these realities risked being remembered through the harshest language available to their critics. Yet when we remove that language and examine context, we see something steadier. We see rulers who understood the stakes of succession. We see mothers defending lineage. We see administrators balancing loyalty and necessity. We see figures who endured the weight of expectation in societies that offered limited room for overt female authority. The story of medieval evil queens ultimately becomes a study in interpretation. It reveals how narratives are shaped by outcome, by gender norms, and by the human need for explanation in times of upheaval. It reminds us that history is layered, and that each generation adds its own emphasis. And so, as we close this long reflection, what remains is not a parade of villains, but a deeper understanding of power under strain. Medieval queens were central to the survival and transformation of their realms. Their reputations, sharpened by conflict, continue to echo. But if we listen carefully, beyond the charged phrases and dramatic titles, we hear something more balanced. We hear the steady pulse of governance, the weight of continuity, and the resilience of those who stood at the crossroads of medieval history. And in that quiet understanding, legend gives way to perspective. As we reach the last calm stretch of this exploration, there is something almost paradoxical about the medieval evil queen. The more closely we study her, the less she resembles a singular villain, and the more she resembles a reflection of her political environment. She appears most vividly at moments when authority is uncertain, when succession is disputed, when loyalties fracture. In other words, she becomes visible precisely when systems are under strain. Isabella of France did not emerge in an era of effortless monarchy. Edward II's reign was already destabilized by favoritism and aristocratic resentment. Margaret of Anjou did not step into a harmonious kingdom. She faced a fragile Lancastrian claim in a society where noble rivalry had deep roots. Fredegund and Brunhilda operated within a Merovingian framework that virtually guaranteed competition among heirs. Each queen's story is inseparable from structural vulnerability. What stands out across centuries is how consistently visible female authority was framed as explanatory. When something went wrong, chroniclers reached for personalities. And when that personality was a queen acting decisively, the moral language sharpened. It was not enough to describe political opposition. It was cast as ambition. It was not enough to describe firmness. It became cruelty. The interpretive lens magnified what might otherwise have been considered ordinary exercises of power. Yet the medieval world required decisiveness. Weakness invited challenge. Uncertainty encouraged rival claims. Inaction could unravel dynastic continuity. Queens positioned at the center of these tensions faced choices with limited margins. The expectation that they embody gentleness while confronting instability created a contradiction almost impossible to sustain. There is also something telling in the way these queens endured in memory. Not every consort is remembered. Many medieval queens pass quietly through the historical record, associated primarily with ceremonial duties and dynastic marriages. The ones who remain vividly present are those who stepped into contested space. Their visibility, even when controversial, ensured that chroniclers could not ignore them. Modern scholarship, with its emphasis on administrative documentation and comparative analysis, reveals a fuller portrait. We see Isabella involved in governance during a regency, not merely in deposition. We see Margaret coordinating alliances, not merely inciting conflict. We see Brunhilda connected to legal reforms, not only rivalry. We see Fredegund operating within a violent political culture, not apart from it. These details restore proportion. Perhaps the most measured conclusion is that the medieval evil queen represents a tension between expectation and necessity. Expectation demanded restraint and symbolic harmony. Necessity demanded engagement and resolve. When queens leaned into necessity, expectation responded with suspicion. History, however, rewards patience. It invites us to look beyond the immediate verdict and into the conditions that produced it. When we do, the narrative shifts. The caricature softens. What remains are rulers navigating fragile systems with limited guarantees. In the end, the enduring fascination with these queens speaks to our broader interest in power itself. How it is gained, maintained, challenged, and remembered. Their stories are not simply tales of intrigue. They are windows into how medieval Europe grappled with legitimacy and continuity. And so we leave them here, not as figures trapped in legend, but as complex participants in the evolving architecture of medieval governance. When we approach them without haste, without reliance on dramatic shorthand, we discover something steadier and more human beneath the crown. That perhaps is the most enduring truth of all. As we settle into this final reflection, truly the last gentle note of this long documentary, it's worth considering how easily we inherit conclusions without revisiting their foundations. The phrase "evil queen" feels definitive, carries certainty, but certainty in medieval history is often constructed after the fact. built upon selective memory and sharpened by the passage of time. If we imagine standing inside a medieval court at the very moment events were unfolding, the clarity would disappear. Factions would argue their legitimacy. Nobles would weigh their loyalties carefully. Clerics would interpret events through theological frameworks. Messengers would carry partial information across long distances. No one would know the ending yet. In that uncertainty, a queen's decision might look necessary to some and reckless to others. Isabella of France, when she aligned with English barons against Edward II, was acting within a context of mounting dissatisfaction. To her supporters, she represented corrective intervention. To her opponents, she embodied overreach. Margaret of Anjou, defending her son's inheritance in a fractured kingdom, appeared steadfast to Lancastrians and destabilizing to Yorkists. Fredegund and Brunhilda, maneuvering through decades of Merovingian rivalry, were seen as protectors of their lineage by allies and as relentless antagonists by rivals. History often compresses these divided perceptions into a single dominant narrative. Over time, the voices of the victors tend to outlast those of the defeated. When political settlements solidify, they require coherence. The memory of past conflict is reshaped into moral explanation. A queen who stood at the center of turbulence becomes a symbol of that turbulence. Yet when we step back and examine the wider structures, inheritance customs, regional rivalries, fiscal strains, and military obligations, the turbulence appears less personal. Medieval governance was not buffered by permanent institutions strong enough to absorb every shock. It was negotiated daily through relationships and oaths. When those relationships faltered, individuals close to the throne inevitably bore the weight of consequence. Another important element is endurance beyond the crisis. Isabella eventually receded from direct power, but the English monarchy continued under her son. Margaret's cause ultimately failed, yet the Wars of the Roses reshaped England's dynastic landscape and paved the way for Tudor consolidation. Brunhilda's dramatic end did not erase the Frankish realm. Instead, her era exposed vulnerabilities that future leaders confronted differently. Fredegund's influence lingered in the shifting patterns of Merovingian rule. In each case, governance adapted. It is tempting to frame these stories as morality plays. But medieval life was rarely so tidy. Authority was contested because succession was uncertain. Alliances were unstable because territory was fragmented. Queens who acted within this system did so not as anomalies, but as participants in its logic. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from their lives is the importance of context. When stripped of dramatic shorthand, their actions align with the broader patterns of medieval political behavior. Kings consolidated power. Nobles formed factions. Regents managed minorities. Queens, when circumstances demanded, did the same. The label of evil obscures this alignment. It suggests deviation where there was often adaptation. It narrows complexity into character judgment. But history invites us to widen the lens again, to see systems alongside personalities. And so, as this extended exploration finally comes to rest, what remains is not a cautionary tale of wickedness, but a portrait of resilience within fragile structures. Medieval queens were central to the survival, transformation, and continuity of their realms. Their reputations, shaped by conflict and chroniclers, continue to echo, but beneath those echoes lies a steadier truth. They mattered because they stood at the heart of power when power was most uncertain. And in understanding that, we leave behind legend and carry forward clarity.